Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's sitting of the Education Committee. So we are now in public session. So I would advise members that the committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online, and advise those in the public gallery that they're welcome to use mobile devices as long as they're in airplane mode, and that all devices are muted, and it's not permitted to take photographs or record any of the meeting. And I'm just noting that my device is currently not on silent, so I need to do that. Item 1, also they're welcome to use mobile devices if they're muted, and it's not permitted to take photographs or record any part of the meeting. So that takes us to item 1 on the agenda, which is apologies. I don't have any apologies unless any other members have any that they want to note. No. I can see Colin is joining online, so again, Colin, if you are having any issues with audio or picking up any part of the meeting, just to link in with the clerk and her team, and we will obviously, if you can use the raise hands function for any indication.
I think Kathy is zooming in as well.
Okay, so also Kathy then also joining remotely, so same goes when she's able to join the meeting. Item 2 on the agenda is chairperson's business. So there's just one item to note. So we have, I want to draw members' attention to an informal meeting of the committee, a formal meeting of the committee in terms of our evidence sessions for the school uniforms bill, which is scheduled for Tuesday morning of next week at 9:15. That will be in the Senate chamber, but there is the option to join remotely as well if that is more suitable for members. Obviously, it would be important that we get quorum, so I'd be grateful if members could link in with the clerk just to confirm availability for that, and also whether they will be joining in person or online. And that's a briefing from the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, and they have expressed an interest in reflecting on some of the rights-related issues in relation to the bill. Item 3 on the agenda is... Oh, sorry, David, did you want to come?
I think I'll after. It was only I was going to suggest with the informal meetings now being formal, so whether it would be an idea to have the link just put out to everybody as just as a matter of course for those meetings. I don't know if that...
It doesn't seem to work like that, actually, unfortunately.
Oh, fair enough.
Yeah.
I intend to try and be here physically, but I just sort of thought it worth having the link just in case.
I think if a link's required at short notice, that can be sorted reasonably straightforwardly. But it seems to be a blanket issue, of it does seem to be an issue, and I don't know why that's the case.
The Zoom is just the broadcasting do it, not my team. So if it were a Teams meeting, we would invite you, but there's just another stage.
No problem. It was just in case that was that's fine.
No, that's fine, David. Okay, that takes us on to item 3, which is declarations of interest. So I would just want to note that a member of the Board of Governors of Colinchie Primary School, just given that we have NIPSO in reporting the briefing today in relation to complaints procedures in the education sector, which would fall under a Board of Governors remit. Do any other members have any declarations they want to raise, David?
I'm a member of the Board of Governors in Mitchell House and Grosvenor Grammar.
Any other members? Nope. If anything arises, as normal, please feel free to do so at any point, just indicate, and that can be noted. That moves us to item 4 on the agenda, and that is matters arising. So I would just draw members' attention. There have just been there's been an additional paper just tabled there in relation to matters arising if you want to refer to that. But I would in the first instance refer members to correspondence from the Committee for the Economy at page 7 and the draft minutes of the concurrent committee meeting of the Committee for the Economy and the Committee for Education, which is at page 9. So just to begin with, that was our meeting last week, which was held in the Senate chamber, and I would want to just seek members' agreement that those minutes are a complete and accurate record of proceedings. Are we agreed? Agreed? Okay. Let's move off. Okay. Okay. There is also tabled there for members proposed correspondence from the Clerk of the Economy Committee to the Departmental Assembly Liaison Officers for both the respective partners. Can I just check that members are content with that correspondence as drafted to be sent? Are we agreed? Agreed. Okay.
Remote members are maybe having a bit of difficulty. If broadcasting can help us out with that.
So as if there's an issue with audio, that would be great if that could be
screen,
sorted. Thank you. The other issue just arising from the concurrent committee meeting, which was discussed briefly at the session just at the end, was that there may be an opportunity and it would be appropriate for the two committees to bring a motion to the assemblies on the matters of joint concern that were discussed during that committee session. I'd certainly, from my perspective, did feel that it was a rather disappointing evidence session from both departments. I didn't feel that there was an awful lot of detail. We were being pointed very much to things that would be announced in the near future that would be coming forward, and it was hard from my perspective to pinpoint any clear progress that had been made in the previous year since the last sitting. So there is a draft text that has been drafted there. Now I think it has been drafted just today, really as an outline text for members as to what they, in terms of essentially getting a motion onto the floor of the Assembly to try and take forward just that range of issues that was discussed in that 14 to 19 framework space, including careers, including the 14 to 19 framework action plan, and some of the policy issues lying behind that around connection and relationship between academic and vocational pathways, statutory school education and further education. I think there's probably a bit more that we can do with that, and members may want to feedback. So if members are, first of all, if I can seek agreement that members are in agreement that bringing a motion on these issues to try and move them forward would be appropriate. Do we have agreement on that, or any views? Agreed. And on that basis, I'm just going to leave it, given that it was only just tabled. If members want to, over the course of the week, reflect on that. Conscious there's probably space for special educational needs to be included in there, and that is my oversight actually in the direction I gave to the clerk in the drafting that was missed. So I think something around saying in the 14 plus space would be appropriate. But if members have any other thoughts around the wording, omissions or things that should be included, please feed that through the clerk, and we'll table that for full discussion next week if everyone's agreed. Great. Peter, do you want to comment?
No, it was just to say, Chair, and you actually picked it up on the way through your commentary there. I think given the focus on SEN at that committee and what happens next for those particular kids in terms of post-education, I think it would be important to have something in there around that. And then just to clarify, in terms of, are you content, Chair, that we sort of edit slightly and send it to the clerk and she sort of pulls everything together? Is that?
I think that's the approach, and I would just to pick up. I mean, I think SEN really should be should get a very very clear reference on that. And now there was some positive noises around the direction of travel legislatively, but just no detail. So I think getting that out on the agenda would be great. Okay, so I will leave that for members to feedback on. Please do; it'll help make the conversation a bit more streamlined next week if we fed back in advance. There are also just tabled for members as a final point, really just to note, given that it ended up being an informal briefing, formal sitting of the Health and Education Committees back at our meeting in Middletown from earlier in the year, the full transcripts of that meeting are now provided for members, which may be useful for future reference, but I propose we just note that at this stage. Okay, so item 5 then is draft minutes. That's found at page 14 of your packs, and it's the minutes of the Education Committee meeting of the 14th of May. I would seek members' agreement that the minutes are a complete and accurate record of proceedings. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Okay. Okay, so that's the initial business out of the way, and that takes us to item 6, which is our first evidence session today. So I'll just let the witness come forward and get seated. The oral briefing today, it is from the Children's Law Centre, and it is a briefing covering issues around the Children's Law Centre response to current work in relation to restraint and seclusion, and also more widely in terms of special educational needs. So the Law Centre will be happy to take questions on both of those issues. Quite a lot of papers just to refer to, so we'll just go through them quickly and then we'll move on to introductions. So we have a briefing note from the committee clerk at page 22. We have a record of an informal meeting of the committee going back to the 14th of May 2024 with Harry's Law campaign. That's at page 24. We have a briefing paper from Harry's Law campaign at page 26, which was provided last year as well. We have the record of an informal meeting on the 25th of March 2025 with the Children's Law Centre at page 50. We have the opening remarks provided for members from the informal briefing from that same session at page 53. And then we have a record of an informal meeting with the committee on the 8th of April with the Department of Education on the subject of restraint and seclusion at page 56. Also in table papers we have a full briefing paper from the Children's Law Centre, and also included the Law Centre's consultation response to the department in relation to the draft statutory guidance. So apologies, there was a lot to get through there in terms of papers. I would just want to indicate at the outset before we move into the briefing, this has been an issue that both in this mandate and the previous that has taken up a considerable amount of the committee's time and attention, and a lot of that, I want to just put on record, was following the campaign spearheaded by Deirdre Shakespeare, and I think it's important just to note Deirdre's contribution to this issue and her ongoing campaign for Harry's Law, which really touches on a lot of the issues that we're going to discuss today in this session. So I think it is important to note that, and that when we're discussing issues around restraint and seclusion, behind that are children and young people who have been impacted by the issue in the past and potentially continue to be so to be impacted. So just moving on from that initial remark, would like to formally welcome Rachel Hogan to committee today. Rachel is the SEND Specialist Legal Advisor from the Children's Law Centre, and will be briefing us today, as we've said, around the challenges of restraint and seclusion, the ongoing work with the Task and Finish group in the department to produce guidance in that space, and potentially other areas around SEN if you're happy to cover those as well. So I'm very happy to have you here at committee, and I thank you for giving up your time. Be handing over for an initial presentation of up to 10 minutes, and then we'll move into question and answer with members, and we will try and keep to 5 minutes per inquiry for each member, just so that we can get through all of the issues. But you're very welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much to the committee for the opportunity to present on this very important issue. I suppose the first thing I might observe is that we call it restraint and seclusion, as if we want to carry out restraint and seclusion. And over time, I suppose we're all developing our language around these complex concepts, and I prefer to call it restrictive practices. Even my own folder in my computer was called restraint and seclusion, and it's a matter of really reframing that, in that we don't want to be restraining and secluding children in schools if we can possibly avoid it, and we never want to be secluding them at all. And the second thing I would like to do is really reiterate the Chair's comments in relation to Deirdre Shakespeare and other parents who have come forward into the public domain and spoken about very personal and painful issues for really quite vulnerable children and young children at that. I think Harry was 4 or 5 years of age when he had been restrained unnecessarily. So restrictive practices is essentially a human rights issue. And I think that's where the starting point has to be in how we solve these issues and these difficulties that we're having in our education settings. So it's a human rights issue which is governed in this jurisdiction by the Human Rights Act of 1998. So there is legislation there that covers it to a point and that applies and can provide for remedies. This brings the European Convention on Human Rights into our domestic law, and the key rights that I would wish to highlight are Article 3, which is a prohibition against torture or inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Article 5, the right to liberty. And Article 8, the right to respect for private life. Private life covers personal integrity, autonomy, choice, physical ability to move around and that sort of thing. And these rights are considered together in tandem with Article 14. And Article 14 is a prohibition against discrimination on basically any ground. For this purpose, I think the most relevant protected characteristic is disability. And in the experience of the Children's Law Centre, the majority of these cases are occurring in relation to children with disabilities, often non-verbal, young boys. So there you have got a range of protected equality characteristics, but disability, age, gender, all coming into it there. The evidence that we have seen from our own casework and through speaking to parents and other organisations does cover children at a range of ages and stages, and both in special schools and mainstream. And I think we have to be very conscious that a lot of the discourse is around what happens in special schools, but actually mainstream schools and specialist classes are having to think about these issues and deal with them as well. We've had about 19 issues raised with us in the past 12 months in relation to restrictive practices, which doesn't sound like an awful lot. The question is, are people identifying restrictive practices that they've used? And then when they have a problem, do they know where to go for a solution? 19 potentially serious issues of restrictive practices used against children in an education setting is actually quite serious. And that's just what the Children's Law Centre has seen in 12 months. And that's after all of this publicity and talk about restrictive practices. In terms of minimum human rights standards, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities are also engaged here. And I'll touch on that later on. So we do have a human rights framework that is live and active. Human rights are not setting specific. They will apply wherever the child is. So if they're in a care setting, in their family home, in a residential children's facility, in an education setting, a OTIS, specialist class, it doesn't matter where the child is, their human rights are their human rights. And I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind here, because what we've seen is the Department of Health has developed its own guidance a number of years ago, and education are now developing their own guidance for education settings. Whilst there are operational differences between settings, the human rights are the same in all settings. And I think we need to get those higher level definitions and scope of this policy need to be the same across all settings, just to prevent confusion amongst staff working with children about what is a restrictive practice and what they should do if there is potential for one to be used. So our education system, I feel, is a little bit behind other systems in terms of its learning, experience and knowledge about how to apply a human rights framework to a situation where restrictive practices may need to be halted, minimised, reviewed or even used on some occasions. The other key issue, I feel, is that there is a lack of an inclusive culture. And we don't have our disability strategy yet from the Department for Communities. And I'd like to ask the question, where is that? We're talking about a bill about incorporating the UNCRPD. There's talk about incorporation, should we incorporate the UNCRC? I think we really do need to do that in some form, because we do not have an inclusive culture here in this jurisdiction, particularly in relation to disability, but there's other issues at play as well, including we're seeing a lot of race issues as well starting to emerge. And we're looking at differences in the way different people of different ages are being treated. But the policy of inclusion within the education sector hasn't been brought forward at pace. We don't even really have a definition of what we mean by inclusion, and I know the department is looking at that. But we have legislative protections in relation to inclusion, such as SENDO, the Special Needs and Disability Northern Ireland Order, which protects children in education from discrimination on the ground of disability. The key reason, I suppose, it's useful to have this conversation today is that there has been a significant delay in bringing forward promised changes. As a result of the campaigns of parents who dragged this difficulty into the light and got us all to sit down and look at it, as lawyers, as MLAs, as teachers, educators, health professionals, and made us all actually stop for a minute and say, hold on, what are we actually doing? And are we complying with human rights? That campaign, Harry's Law campaign, actually made really, really significant progress under the last mandate in terms of the department had carried out a strategic review. And you'll see in your papers there's a whole list of things that happened up to that, and I'll not go through that in the time I have here, but the briefing's available. It'll be available online for anyone who wants to look at that historical delay. We got to a point where the department had looked at recommendations made by the Children's Commissioner, looked at all the parental evidence, and had come up with its position against each recommendation as to what it was going to do. And the crux of that was that Michelle McIlveen, at the time he was the Minister for Education, had agreed to bring forward legislative reform, so to repeal Article 4.1c of the Education Northern Ireland Order 1998, which is a power to restrain pupils for the maintenance of order and discipline. Children's Law Centre has issues with the totality of Article 4 and feels that we need to start to look at the language that we're using in relation to children, particularly with protected equality characteristics like disability or young age. Do we really want to be talking about policies about force? Notably in the health guidance, force is only used in the sense that we shouldn't be using force. We should protect children from force. So the language of force, we're coming from the wrong angle, and again, we need to reframe that into a human rights perspective of stopping using restrictive practices as soon as we possibly can, or not employing them in the first place. So if we think about Harry's case, and I know we'll hear more about that later today, could something have been done differently? Should something have been done differently? Yes and yes. And reviewing it now, we've got lots of information about how and why and what went wrong. I think it's important to realise as well that the guidance that Health have put out came after all of that. So again, if we'd had that guidance, would that have happened to Harry and other children who've been taken away and put in rooms to be secluded as a punishment by untrained assistants? And those are just two examples that I think everyone's pretty well aware of. And the committee heard harrowing evidence, frankly, from organisations and from Deirdre herself, who very bravely spoke out on the record about this. I've seen her speaking numerous times, and every single time I see her speaking, she becomes very emotional, and the trauma is still very real. And I think we have to realise that restrictive practices can be harmful, and that harm can be long-term and lasting, and therefore we should be very, very reluctant to use them if we can avoid it at all. Now, in fairness to the Department of Education, even in its current stance, where we feel that there has been a pause, there's a reflection going on at the minute, there's no move forward in legislative reform, which I would like to see some more scrutiny about. How are we going to fix this if we don't reform the legislation that talks about force? Why are we pausing? I'm not too clear on the reasons for that, and I think we need to think about that and explore that some more. The department has done so much work on this, as has the Children's Law Centre, the Children's Commissioner, the Human Rights Commission, the Equality Commission. Everyone's been involved. We've all worked together. There's been a great gathering of information and evidence. And I have to say, there's a bit of a pile of bits of paper here in front of me, of bits of the reports that I've reviewed again and reminded myself about to speak to you today. And I can only imagine what it's like for a teacher or a school leader when a problem pops up in school and they go to look for an answer. And if they have to look at all the stuff that I've looked at before I came here today, they wouldn't have time to do any teaching for about a week or two. So I think we need to make it easy. We need to make it easy for school leaders to know what to do. So the strategic review happened. Michelle McIlveen wrote out to schools and said, we're going to do this reform and we'll write out to you further. It was all very positive. Unfortunately then, the Assembly had stopped operating, and we've come back with a whole set of new personnel everywhere. And that includes amongst the community and voluntary sector, the new minister. We've got virtually a different committee here as well, and new civil servants in the department. And there's a danger that we forget why we're here and what we're doing and where we're going. So I think we need to get this back on track, and we've been working hard with the department to try and square the circle, if you like, and make sure that we do get back on track and that we comply with the legal rights of disabled children and young people in education settings. So CLC is very much a critical friend, if you like, in relation to the department. And we can be quite critical, and that's our role, to speak the truth to power, so to speak. Looking at where we are now, we have the Human Rights Act 1998, we have the Northern Ireland Act 1998, Section 75, Equality Duties. And beside that, we have a 1998 piece of education legislation that's not compliant with human rights and missed the boat a little bit in terms of proofing for that piece of legislation. So I think the case is well made for reform, and I needn't maybe say too much more about that. Clearly, we believe that it should proceed urgently. One of the difficulties in creating guidance is statutory guidance. If you're creating the guidance before you have the legislative change, then you're always fighting against the inconsistencies between talking about force and talking about restrictive practices, which is slightly broader. Force is an emergency response, generally speaking, whereas restrictive practices are more nuanced. A really important issue is that we have children's services cooperation. Education cannot do this on their own. Health cannot do it on their own, in our view. We as lawyers only have part of the picture, and you as MLAs will have part of the picture, and everyone needs to be going in the same direction and getting this thing moving quickly. Because while we all wait, pause and reflect, there are children in our education settings who are vulnerable, who cannot speak for themselves, and who may be having human rights infringements completely unwittingly in their settings, because teachers don't go out to do this on purpose. They actively avoid it. The other issue is some school leaders are a bit frightened and fearful now because they're not sure what they can or can't do, and they would really appreciate the guidance coming forward. So we don't want to leave gaps in protection for our most vulnerable children and young people because of a lack of cooperation. When decisions are being made, you need everyone round the table. In order to make a best interest decision for any child, you need everyone relevant there. That includes the parent, health professionals if they're involved, allied health professionals, nursing staff, school staff, and the child themselves if they're able to speak and contribute to the debate. But often their parent will be their voice if they're not able to be verbal and communicate in some way. There should be mandatory standardised training. My belief is that there wasn't a plan to roll out training with this guidance, and I think that thankfully has been reversed and that there will be training. That training needs to be high quality, standard. It needs to match with what health is doing to the largest degree possible, and it needs to be regular and repeated. A wee bit like we do our safeguarding training and our data protection. You always need refreshers on it. New staff are coming. It's too important of an issue, and we need that training. We also need proper reporting and monitoring systems, and I've been assured that that will be the case, but we need to make sure that that is the case, and that we also collect disaggregated equality data so that we know who is being subjected to force or restrictive practices and where do they fit within the Section 75 equality groupings. And I think what that would show up at a baseline would be that it's disabled young children. And we need to see if we're making progress in removing these practices. We need to know how much of this is happening in a way that schools don't feel threatened, that they can actually share the truth of what they're facing in their environments. In relation to school environments, many of them aren't fit for purpose. I've been sitting in front of school leaders, experienced, confident school leaders with really good best interest practice who have been sitting in a meeting with me, literally in tears, saying, what am I going to do tomorrow? And that is a direct quote from a principal who said, I can do this today, I can put that child there, and this child here, and this one over there. I can't put them all in these spaces together. I have no more room. There's no more room for a porta cabin. They're my pupils. They need to be here. I want to educate them. What am I going to do? And he's looking at me, and I'm a lawyer. And I'm thinking, well, I'm a lawyer. I don't know what you're going to do. Here's what the law says, though. So you have to start in finding the solution with what the human rights framework is, get the right people around the table, figure out what processes are in play, and find a solution. But I do really feel for school leaders who are facing quite difficult decisions, and I really feel for families. I mean, I'm dealing with a family at the moment who their child is not in school at all, hasn't been in school for 2 years, would have been restrained in school, is having to be restrained at home. And that child is non-verbal and has no other way to express themselves than using behaviour. And we're trying to wait for specialist placement to be available, and we're sitting still waiting, and there's no confirmation. You could find a lot of money put into making a special placement, and then it breaks down on day one because the staff say, I'm not going to restrain that child. We need 5 people for that. We're not trained. School staff aren't trained in holds if they had to do a hold. So it's nuanced, it's complex, and it's difficult, but it's really urgent. And school leaders and school staff are in a position of they may be liable under the Human Rights Act, civil liability, assault, criminal liability, negligence, safeguarding. There are structures there, but the guidance and the support is not there. There's a bit of a tension, I feel, between health and education on this, because education staff on the ground are not getting enough support from health in terms of nursing and allied health professionals, particularly in special schools. But I do wonder what the position is in mainstream, particularly in specialist classes. The support isn't there, the workforce isn't there. EA's opened loads of special classes, maybe without saying to the allied health professionals, if you've got staff that can come and do OT and physio and advise on seating and everything else that needs to be advised on, that the workforce isn't there to keep up with that crisis response pace. So we do need to reset, and we need to collaborate. We have corresponded at fair length with the Department of Education, and they with us. We had considered our position on the task and finish group that's currently running, which has met a number of times now. And I know that RCN, the College of Nurses, has come out of that, and I can understand why, absolutely. And we had to consider our position. Our position is slightly different in that we are coming from a legal perspective, and we've put in many years of work into this. This is a very serious legal issue, and we feel we've something to offer the department by way of support, and we feel it's too important, and that we need to stay in this process, and we need to monitor and keep under review our position at all times. And my feeling is that the department is trying to work with us in relation to this, and there has been some positive progress. But where there is not progress is legislative reform. So I think I'd leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a really, really comprehensive summary, and I think it's very clear of the need to strike that balance between all of the different stakeholders who are involved in these processes, but with a child rights focus at the heart of it, and that's undoubtedly complex, and it is a difficult issue to navigate. You've been very clear in your briefing and in your evidence today that it's that legislative reform piece that you feel from the Children's Law Centre perspective is missing, and specifically Article 4 broadly, but Article 4.1c of the 1988 Education Order, that is potentially the major barrier to progress here. Can you expand on what the provisions of that article are, specifically why they make delivering guidance around restrictive practices so problematic and difficult?
Yeah, I think this is a real issue and a real problem. When you look at the draft that the department produced for consultation, which we responded to in detail, you could see the tension between trying to regulate restrictive practices on the one hand, but trying to also regulate a power to restrain. And those two things do not sit comfortably together. Mm-hmm. So Article 4 is entitled Power of a Member of Staff to Restrain Pupils. And 4.1 is that a member of the staff of a grant-aided school may use, in relation to any pupil at the school, such force as is reasonable in the circumstances for the purpose of preventing the pupil from doing or continuing to do any of the following. Namely, so 4.1a is committing any offence. That's any offence at all. B, causing personal injury to or damage to the property of any person, including his own property. And then C, which is the one the Children's Commissioner has honed in on, 4.1c, engaging in any behaviour prejudicial to the maintenance of good order and discipline at the school or among any of its pupils, whether that behaviour occurs during a teaching session or otherwise. Now, the difficulty with that is you're using force to maintain discipline. And repeated sessions of the Committee on the Rights of the Child and also the Committee on the Rights on Persons with Disabilities has said that you should never use force in order to maintain discipline, particularly in relation to a disabled child. The reason being there's an imbalance of power between the adult and the disabled child who is disadvantaged because of their disability, their youth, perhaps being non-verbal and having no control over the situation. So if you go in and put hands on a child and you've made the decision to do that, and then the question is, was it reasonable? Well, that's a very broad and discretionary parameter. Using reasonable force. Now, there's a lot of guidance around attached to this that flows from this from the time, and there was a review of some of that guidance, and it tries to guide staff not to use excessive force, but use of any force to maintain order and discipline is just a whisker away from when we used to hit people at school, frankly, because you have staff in a situation at that moment, and in their mind they have a power to do this, and they do have the power to do it under this. And there's a question in my mind about whether there's an incompatibility with the Human Rights Act here. That's a whole different day's work. So, teaching teachers that they have a power to do this to maintain discipline, then we see cases like a classroom assistant taking a young boy off and putting him in a 8-foot by 4-foot room. You've been naughty. Go in there and think about what you've done. It's so draconian. It's not the way we do things today. We take a positive behaviour approach and we try to teach the wanted behaviour. And we force. It's not that you could never use force lawfully. Obviously, if there's a really emergency situation and you need to protect somebody from serious harm, it would be ridiculous not to try and stop somebody from really hurting themselves, such as a child stepping out in the road or somebody extremely aggressive doing something in the environment that's going to harm somebody, obviously that's within reasonable parameters even under the human rights framework. So I think there's so many difficulties with this. I think it needs a lot of analysis, a lot of thought and careful reform, but that process hasn't begun, and that's the issue.
Just, I mean, I think your opening sort of response to that really summed it up, that we've got a tension between the department regulating a power to restrain versus producing guidance to eliminate restrictive practice, that those two things are always going to be in tension, is probably putting it mildly.
Not in the same space, really.
Yeah.
And I think in response to that, the department maybe tried to roll back a little bit and just look at restraint. But I think, and that was really going to be a problem for the Children's Law Centre and others. But I think we're in a position now where we are hopefully looking at that broader range of restrictive practices, because frankly there's no point in doing any of this if we don't look at all of it. And I think as well, if you look at I don't know if members would have had a chance to look at the health guidance, but the 3 steps to positive practice, I mean, I would say to any teacher who's looking at this and a bit worried, if you're a bit worried, lift that and have a look at it. It's actually a really good human rights framework, and it really will help. So, and I think that's now starting to come into the conversation, thankfully. I think we're hopefully starting to embrace those type of concepts.
But from your engagement, and look again, I'm very conscious you're in a position of you sit on the task and finish group, and you've been clear you want to continue to work constructively with the department. Have you got any sense from recent engagement through that forum of any direction of travel towards repeal of Article 4.1c, or does it feel that has been closed down, or is it still on the table?
Yeah, it's in reality, I would call it a refusal because of the effluxion of time. But perhaps that's unfair in the sense that the Assembly had been stopped for a period and it's a different minister. And the minister has to make his own decision. So that's the position that the minister will decide. And what I don't know, and I really don't know, is why the minister is pausing that decision instead of just making a decision and then moving forward. So the position appears to be, let's get this guidance. You know, I mean, there's been a lot of work done by the department on the guidance. Let's get this done, and then we'll see where we are. And I don't think that's quite good enough. I don't think it's right, and I don't understand why. There could be reasons for it that I don't know, so I don't want to be unfair. And it's something that we will be asking to find out more information around that in our ongoing correspondence.
From a legal perspective, which is obviously what you bring to this issue, can guidance be effective and human rights compliant with Article 4.1c on the statute book, in your opinion?
It'll be a fudge. It'll be a fudge. It already is a bit of a fudge because the old, existing guidance is already sort of saying, don't really do that if you can avoid it. Just, don't do that. That's bad. You get into trouble if you use excessive force. It's a very difficult area.
This is years in the making.
It's
You're
years
saying
in the
let's not fudge it. Let's get it right when we have the opportunity.
I would
to
prefer
do
to
so.
get it right.
Yeah. Okay.
But there's a degree of urgency, and I think that puts everybody in a very difficult position. We need to move forward on this quickly, and I think we would really want to see that legislative reform moving now, and then we can just get on with the work.
That's really helpful. I'll just raise one other point and then open up to other members. You did highlight clearly, very clear children's rights perspective, and it's absolutely right, that should be our starting point. But you did also highlight just the very difficult context that a lot of schools are operating in, and we hear evidence, and we all locally hear evidence from school leaders, teachers, classroom assistants of injuries being sustained in schools and having to wear protective clothing. And there are some special schools where environmentally, I would absolutely agree that some of that, the environmental challenges are driving some of the challenging behaviour. And I know that you were very clear, you're speaking as a lawyer, you're not a policy maker, and I do understand that. But in terms of looking at the wider picture of this, if we don't deal with the environmental issues within our special schools in particular, but potentially some of those specialist provisions in mainstream as well, is there a risk that even if we get really good guidance, that it may not be effective because we're not educating our young people in environments that are actually appropriate and meeting their needs?
There's so many issues connected to this that are ongoing, and one of the issues is children being inappropriately placed. And I had the benefit of speaking to a lot of school leaders recently at a conference, and this was a big issue that was coming forward to me, that the EA is placing children in inappropriate placements, where school has maybe said, we can't meet the needs of this child, and they're being placed anyway because it's a numbers game at this time of the year, let's face it. And the environments are crowded, and that's special schools and mainstream schools. And some schools are carrying more of the burden and the weight of responsibility than others. And I think there are some moves afoot to look at that. Guidance is only guidance. It's only one part of the jigsaw. If guidance and legislative reform, guidance was published tomorrow and legislative reform started, that school leader is going to be in exactly the same position, except that he's going to have a framework for making the right decision in the best interests of the child. But what the school leader is sitting with is a range of interests, and this is what human rights is all about. You're balancing different people's interests. So you have that child that you're looking at, you have all the other children in the class, other children in the school, and you have your staff to think about. And I have seen staff standing in front of me, covered in cuts and bruises, injured, they've had fractures, really serious, very serious injuries, serious situation. And the school leader is then sitting going, right, I have a duty of care to my staff, and I have a duty of responsibility to safeguard all of the children. This child and these children all have a right to education, and they're all educable with the right support. And there's usually a whole pile of unmet needs as well. And we really need to bring all of these policies together. So placing children in the correct placements, making sure there's enough specialism going into those placements, and trying to adapt our environments as best as we can and as quickly as we can. This is a crisis, and it's actually increasing the need for restrictive practices. If those children there's some children really need space, they need to run, they need to burn off energy, and they need sensory spaces, and if they had that, then they wouldn't become so agitated and distressed, and then restrictive practices wouldn't happen. So it'd be interesting to have data on this and on what makes a difference. We haven't even started really. We've done a lot of work, but we haven't really started the real work. So yeah, there's no quick fix to this. This has been a long time in the making, and it'll be a long time to be fixed.
Final point for a very quick answer, and this is definitely not on the space of a quick fix. We've heard evidence from principals, from parents, and from health professionals as well, around the need to perhaps look at a different model of education for a particular cohort of young people for whom the special school environment, particularly the types of environments we have in Northern Ireland, is not meeting their needs. Something that has a real wraparound of education and health support, with appropriate facilities, appropriate outdoor space, delivered in partnership with health and education, not education putting something in place with health feeding in now and again, so that those young people are not being excluded and are not being repeatedly exposed to restrictive practice. Is that something from the Law Centre's perspective that you think merits consideration around for young people with very particular sets of needs, that we need to look at perhaps whether there are better models of education that could better meet their needs?
I think that's a very difficult question from a human rights perspective, because ultimately what we would aim for in terms of, say, the UNCRPD would be that all children could be educated together regardless of their needs. There's an attractiveness to the proposition that you create a third space where you put children with complex needs and behaviour that is challenging to manage, and you put health and education around that. There's an attractiveness to that. There's also a difficulty with that because you're segregating those children out of their community into a different space nearly. There's different views on that. I've spoken to a few different people, and it's interesting. Some people would say that child shouldn't be in a school. That's been said to me in a meeting, and I'm like, well, they're a child and they're entitled to education, so of course they should be in a school. So there's a bit of an attitude there in education settings. Health take the view that, oh, get on with it. We have children in our settings and we can manage them, so education, you get on with it. There's not a consensus on this, and I think we have to be very, very careful with it. I think that everything should be on the table. There is a very big issue with children who have highly distressed behaviour at the minute, and we see that in the respite debate. In health and social care reform, there's not enough or any respite. And those same children are not maybe going to school or not going full time. And my client, as I've told you, is not in school. And their parents are in a totally desperate situation that is beyond measure, trying to get through every day. And that child has many positive attributes and abilities, and she has skills that aren't being developed. Her personality's not being developed. She's sitting at home with her parents, getting distressed, having her needs met, getting distressed, having her needs met. There's no specialism around her. And the question is there some middle ground somewhere? I don't know, and I won't take a position on that because I think we need to be very careful with it. What I do know is that we need very significant health and education cooperation on talking about this problem, opening it out, thinking about the human rights consequences of what we're talking about here, and actually making sure that the specialism is where it needs to be. And these are children, these are families, you know, and they're desperately needing help, and they're not going to school at all. I mean, if my child wasn't going to school at all, I'd be very, very upset and distressed. And I would try, and they've tried and tried and tried, and they just can't get anywhere. And we've had tribunals, and we're going to courts, and there's damages claims, and there's all sorts of fun legal things that we can do. But frankly, I'd rather we spend our energy on coming to solutions. But ultimately, if legal input is needed, then that's what we can do, and that's what we would do. So that's maybe not a very clear answer to your question, but I think everything should be on the table. We need to do something for that particular cohort. It's a small group, so we can identify them easily, and they're highly at risk, as are their families and their siblings.
And I think whenever the model looks like you've referenced, it's the appropriateness of placement and then the appropriateness of support that goes around them. So no, that's really helpful. And I suppose I'll just conclude by saying I would want to put on record just my thanks for the work the Law Centre does, because in terms of my own constituency office and engagement with yourselves, it's certainly just such a reliable source of expert advice when issues such as these come across our desk in the office. So that is, I just wanted to put that on record. Okay, I'll hand over to the Deputy Chair at this stage.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Rachel, for your answers to the questions so far. And I suppose you've outlined a situation where schools are operating in a regulatory vacuum where unlawful restrictive practices have almost become normalised. And I know you say there's no quick fix, and I agree. But the pathway to a fix is there, and it's a solution to be found through a human rights framework. And the difficulty is that I was on the previous Education Committee in the previous mandate, as you know, and we heard harrowing examples there of restrictive practices. One example of a young boy who was stimming, a child with autism, had his hands tied to the chair with a school bag. And more recently we heard of a child being tethered to a fence, and his parents were totally unaware of that until they received the child's yearbook, and there were actually photographs of the child tethered to the fence.
This is normal.
Exactly, this has become normalised. And I use the example of Muckamore. And we know what has been happening in there. The use of seclusion was being used way out of proportion to what it even should have been under the guidelines at the time. Patients being put in seclusion 70 and 80 times a month. And this was before even evidence came about from CCTV cameras. But the RQIA, who were supposed to be the watchdog, were aware that seclusion was being used as often as that because records were being kept of it. And they did nothing about it. And I asked them, why did it not raise a red flag at the time? And they said it should have, but they couldn't explain why it didn't. And so we have this situation where actually unlawful practices are being normalised. And how do we get around that?
I think that's a really important point, and I think it's a good starting point for change that we can make maybe more quickly as well. That is a cultural issue about the way we think about disabled people, and it is a training issue in terms of human rights and disability equality. And you can teach people that quite easily. You can go and do a session or a few sessions and explain what a human rights framework looks like, and that we're dealing with people. I mean, when you think about Muckamore, you tend to think, oh, isn't that a really extreme and terrible example, and shouldn't we all be ashamed of ourselves? But on a lower level, we're seeing this type of thing all the time, and I've been doing this particular role for nearly 17 years. And there's many times I've walked through particular school environments and seen certain practices and come out and thought, I have that feeling in the pit of my stomach that something's not quite right with that. but they must know what they're doing. And then all this, it takes parents then, to go, actually, my child isn't behaving the way they normally do, something's wrong. And I mean, Harry in particular was able to express that something was wrong by becoming withdrawn. He wasn't able to say, I wasn't too happy because it was strapped by the feet and the hands and a lap belt and a table in a chair, and I wanted to get that toy over there or whatever, but I couldn't move. And also, children don't have the understanding that it's not normal because it's been happening to them all the time, and disabled people. And families, Deirdre's an exception and others like her, because they also don't have an understanding that it's not normal, because they've been told it's normal. Your child's different and they're treated differently, and we'll take them in later and then go home earlier, and they can be sent home when we like, and etc. And we tie them to a fence. I can't even begin to process that. That is very shocking. But that there's a normality and a culture in the school amongst leaders, teachers, classroom assistants, caretaking staff that work in the canteen. I mean, everybody is liable to do these practices or be complicit in them. And we can't be complicit anymore. We have to wake up and take a person-centred approach. And if you wouldn't want it done to yourself or your own child, then you wouldn't want it to have been done to anybody else's child. And we need to just pause and think, why are we doing that? Why was that being done? Who decided to do it? Is it agreed? Is it documented? Where is it written down that it's being done? So the framework that we're trying to bring forward is train people. This is what a restrictive practice is. You shouldn't be doing it unless there's no other way. You're looking for the less restrictive option every single time. So instead of putting Harry in a wheeled chair and strapping him in to take him to the dinner hall, maybe there's something he would attract him to go to the dinner hall, like some incentive that we could, or toy, or something that he likes, and he'll come along and say, we can have that here, come with me. And I'm just, making up examples off the top of my head. I'm not an operational expert. But you just know yourself from working with young people and people in your family. Of course, there's always a way to use a positive way to explain things, as opposed to restraint, seclusion, restrictive practice. And another thing we need to maybe think about, which is more complicated again, is chemical restraint, because we have a lot of very, very complex young people who are using or who've been prescribed psychoactive drugs, or drugs that have a sedative effect, and they're being prescribed those possibly because they need them by a psychiatrist. And schools are in the space of, we're not quite sure where we fit here. Do we give this in school? This is really complicated. But on one level, it's not complicated. Once you can sort of see the light, so to speak, and think about it from a person-centred and human rights-based approach, you will probably make the right decision. And there's basically 3 things you need to keep in mind to make the right decision. First of all, non-discrimination. Second of all, best interests. And third of all, the voice of the child, whether that be through themselves, their parents, the people that work with them, their teacher. Getting that, what do we need to do here for this person, and what do they want? Those are basics, but they're not been taught.
Yeah, and we had a meeting with the RCN a couple of weeks ago, with Rosaleen Kelly, who was the person who developed the policy within health, and she explained the reason that they withdrew from the Task and Finish group was because they didn't believe the guidance was human rights compliant, or that it was going in that direction. And I'm just wondering, given that, because to me, it's quite simple. You find a solution based on a human rights framework.
Actually, is that simple?
I mean, it doesn't take a genius to see that. And the fact that it hasn't been done, or progress hasn't been made, from what we can see, I mean, I suppose it's an unfair question, but is there resistance to dealing with this issue through a prism of human rights?
Rachel, could I just ask, just to try and answer it briefly? We've run quite over time
brief.
on this inquiry, so just a brief answer. I know that's tricky, but just to make sure we do get the opportunity to bring other members in.
To understand. I have the greatest of respect for Rosaleen Kelly, actually, and her work with the RCN developing the guidance. And I work closely with all the members that have been involved in this, and I totally respect the decision that they made, and totally understand it, and could have made the same decision ourselves in a sense. We're all coming from slightly different perspectives. Is there a resistance to a human rights approach? I don't think there is, actually. I think the policy aim is to have a human rights approach, but I just wonder about the level of expertise that is available to ensure that happens. Now, I've provided a lot of advice, as have others, as is RCN.
As did
And the
Rosen
question
Kelly
is,
told
why
us.
is that not being...
Rosen Kelly also told us that they offered the
Yeah.
Education Department advice on the basis of their experience, and it was refused.
We have to draw a line there as
Yeah.
we are way over time.
Suppose
But I
I've
think other
just
members
said
can
that
pick up very quickly
the
just to
health,
finish.
the health colleagues have been very willing to provide their advice and support, and we would support that they do provide that advice and support, and this process cannot be successful without that, and we will do everything we can to bring that support back in.
Thank you.
So just conscious other members are keen to come in, and this is a complex area that the committee has a long history of engaging with, and the issues are not always straightforward. But if I could just ask for members to try and get to questions maybe as quickly as they can, to give Rachel the opportunity of time to address the answer comprehensively. Peter, you'd indicated. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chair, and Rachel, thank you for your evidence. It's worth noting just what Pat said. There are some extremely harrowing examples of what's happened in Northern Ireland, and Pat outlined a few of those. I'm not going to dwell on those. I suppose my questions probably are around more a sort of balance of rights approach, Rachel, if that's okay. I'm thinking in particular, not necessarily of seclusion, but of sort of restrictive practices, and the balance between, say, in a classroom setting of a child being, say, physically violent to another child or to the teacher. I mean, would you first of all accept that actually, you can call it reasonable force is obviously the term that you're talking about as unreasonable perhaps, but using some level of force or restriction on that child in order to protect either another child or a teacher, which is probably where some teachers I think are probably at in terms of this issue. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. There is a balance of rights, of course. And if you have got a critical situation where someone's about to be seriously hurt, that is the time when you can use force lawfully. And that's actually not, there's no difficulty with that. I think we tend to focus sometimes, and it happened in the guidance actually, where you might take an extreme, that wasn't an extreme example, that's a day-to-day reality,
It is.
to be fair. But sometimes there's extreme examples, like knife-wielding children coming running down the corridor type of thing was in there, which isn't your norm, hopefully. These things can happen, and in the environments and spaces we're in, there can be an immediate risk of serious harm. And that is when human rights law would allow you to intervene. And in fact, if you didn't intervene to prevent serious harm and act in the best interests of the child or the other child or the teacher, then you'd be in a difficulty. So it's not a difficult question in one sense. It's difficult on the ground to manage though, and you need the human rights framework sitting there so that you can have thought as a school leader, what will I do if? What is our plan? Who's responsible? Who's going to record and document it? Who are we going to tell about it? And now what are we going to do tomorrow? So that's where the framework helps to answer those questions.
And do you think in terms of education, I read the DOH policy document, which does clearly say that restrictive practice can be used. I've got it here in front of me, and in terms of, the general principles. I suppose I am thinking, because I think we can be, when we were talking about this, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I suppose I am coming to this with a fear that something might be produced, or there may be a push towards something being produced that actually will go so far as not to protect the child in the classroom who perhaps is having force used against them, or the teacher who is very, very concerned about whether they put hands on a child to restrain them in some way, whether some case will be taken against them for that. Are you do you think we will get to a place where this balance of rights can be found, where children can be protected, teachers can be protected within a human rights context? Let me put it like that.
Yes, absolutely. This balance has to be found. It is imperative that this balance is found. And that is why this guidance is so critically important and so has been urgent for a long time, because the responsibilities and the rights are already there. It's the guidance, the training, the understanding, the recording, the monitoring, the reviewing that isn't there. So it's not that you can never carry out a restrictive practice, but your goal is to not have to do it, or to do the least restrictive measure that you have to do. And also, a restrictive practice can seem very benign. It's not bothering anybody. It's still a restrictive practice. So it's really about knowing, I am carrying out a restrictive practice. It's documented. There's a difference between emergency situations, I suppose, and day-to-day operation. Some restrictive practices are regularly needed for some reason. That is okay, as long as you are doing it in a proportionate manner, reviewing it, seeing, can I do something less restrictive? Is the child, has there been an improvement? Can we do something different? It's not that you can never do it, and I think that's where there is misunderstanding out in our community, where we need to bring this forward. And of course, there's a balancing of rights always, and that's totally correct.
I ask one, it'll be a really quick one.
Very briefly.
Again, on the health document, which I'm sure you're very familiar with and you reference, it says restrictive interventions, restraint and seclusion should not be used for any reasons relating to disability. And when I read that, I kind of thought, again, let's apply the last example I gave to you, and you might have an answer for this. If you don't, that's okay. But let's say...
Can I just say reasons related to disability is one of the most litigated concepts.
Is that right? Okay, so I'm
I'll do my best
I'm
with
happily
this one.
walking into a minefield here. And this it may sound like a silly question, but if you had one SEND child who was using some level of physical force on another child in that classroom, does that, to what I read out to you, not mean that restraint couldn't be used in that child? I can read it out again. Restrictive interventions, restraint and seclusion should not be used for reasons related to disability.
I think that needs to be teased out a bit. I can see why you're going down that line with it.
Yeah.
I think that is more designed for the Harry scenario. He was put in a confined chair that's designed for a physically disabled child and wheeled around when he can walk. So he was treated that way for reasons related to his disability, which happens to be autism and global developmental delay.
Yeah.
He won't go down the corridor, we'll stick him in this wheelchair and he'll go. That's wrong.
Of course.
But I know what you mean. That language, I suppose, it's saying that you shouldn't be, in a sense, treating somebody in a way because they're disabled that you wouldn't do to someone who's not disabled, if that makes sense. It's not that you can't carry out any practice on a child who's disabled. If it's proportionate and it's in their best interest and there's no lesser restrictive option, you could do it.
I agree completely. I think it's really poorly drafted, because when I read through that, I thought, if that was, I had that guidance, say this isn't an education document, this is a health document, but as I read that, I sort of thought, does that mean, that clearly says to me, I cannot use restraint on a disabled child? And the first thing I thought was, but what if a child who has special needs, for whatever reason, and as you said, a lot of communication and behaviour go hand in hand. I read that and I thought, does that mean you couldn't restrain one child, perhaps from hurting another child? Just as I read it, it's not.
It's unhelpful in a sense, not to be critical. It's a sort of day-to-day question you get. You need to start from the higher level framework and build that, and then you build out the training, and then you start to talk about this with people who are making decisions. What do we mean by that? Or if you thought, oh, that was a bit unclear, I can see where you're coming from. We'll draft it slightly differently so that it is clear. Mm-hmm. You don't have to. You want it to be as closely aligned as it possibly can be, so that if you have a physiotherapist or an occupational therapist coming into a school, that the guidance is not different, that they're governed by, and yet there's statutory guidance that they're also governed by. The two things need to sit together really tightly and neatly. I do think that there's an effort to work towards that. There's also quite a resistance to, we're not doing that just because health did it. And that's unhelpful. I think we just need to put all that, aggravation aside and all get on the same page, which you can see from our conversation today, we're all on the same page, frankly.
Draw a line there. I know you have so much to say on the topic, Rachel. That's to bring that one to a close. I suppose I just want to make a comment, just picking up on some of the stuff Peter raised earlier. I think it is important to maintain that distinction between restrictive practices that are governed by guidance that everybody understands, and that notion of using reasonable force to maintain order and discipline. Those are two different things. Dealing with an emergency scenario emerging, I think it is important that we don't conflate those. That would, from my perspective, certainly. Michelle, you had indicated next.
Thanks, Chair. Rachel, thank you so much. Not many people come here and sit on their own at that desk to give us evidence, but I think you have the expertise with about 4 people, so it's been really great to listen to you today, and it's appreciated. There's loads to ask, but I'm going to start with, I think there seems to be a couple of different points of tension. One is around the repeal of Article 4.1c, and it feels like it's a no-brainer, and for me, I don't know if it's helpful to maybe reframe it away from why would we repeal this to, if we're sitting here in 2025 and someone tried to introduce a piece of legislation that was worded in this way, it would get nowhere. No would we bring that forward and nobody would support it.
I always give the example, imagine if we're getting a new director soon, imagine if our new director comes in and says, right folks, you lot are a bit unruly, you're all, want your rights and you want us to do this and that. I think we better get a policy on reasonable force in the workplace so that you people all do what you're meant to do and you keep order and behave yourselves. So we're here to draft policy on how we might, force you to go to your office when the tea break's over and not be out there chatting at the water cooler. Not to be flippant about it, but you'd never accept a policy on force in the workplace or on force in a children's care home. Having a policy on force, it needs to be reframed through the lens of human rights. That piece of legislation, I think, just missed the boat very slightly time-wise, and it's just unfortunate. If it had been made 2 or 3 years later, maybe it wouldn't have been written in that way.
Yeah, so it seems really, in that context, not that contentious to remove that.
I really don't think it's contentious at all. I honestly don't know why it would. And I thought to myself, is it school leaders, are they worried about not having the power to restrain? Do they think that they'll not be able to do anything? But the teachers that I've spoken to aren't. They're on the exact same page that we're all talking about today. They're not worried.
You've been very clear about where the guidance could assist in terms of when to intervene and when not to in different scenarios, and I think
those are operational judgment calls
exactly.
made by experts who work with children every day, and a lot of them are doing a really brilliant job of it. I think we have to thank them, all of our teachers and leaders, for the difficult decisions they make every day. Sometimes people get things wrong. We all do get things wrong at times, and it's trying to minimise that, make sure people know what to do and that they're confident. And another really important thing for them is, if they don't know what to do, they need to go outside themselves and get expertise outside the school and escalate it up to the EA or to whoever, to health, and get help. You should not be on your own with these problems.
One of the other points, I guess, of tension would be around the prospect of having 2 different sets of guidance for health and education. So tell us about why you believe that would or would not, what the risks are around that, what your concerns are.
Yeah, I think the difficulty is that you end up with confusion, particularly if you're a health worker working in an education setting. It could create a difficulty because you don't know which one to follow. The United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child had recommended that there was a guidance for the jurisdiction, one piece of guidance for the jurisdiction, and it would flow from that would be cross-departmental. Now, when Health put their draft of their guidance out, it's one of the few times that I've been able to say, gosh, that's great, that's a great piece of work there, but actually it needs to be cross-departmental and it needs to cover everywhere. But it's no good just saying, you shouldn't be doing this in health and social care settings, what about education? And this flows from the Mental Capacity Act, doesn't specifically and overtly cover education. We had recommended that it ought to. But education settings are still having to deal with deprivations of liberty authorisations. That's another day's work again, but if you're routinely restricting someone, it may come to the line where you're actually depriving them of liberty. And to deprive someone of their liberty, you may need lawful authorisation and access to speedy review by an independent tribunal. So if you're 16 or 17, you're entitled to those safeguards, such as a review by a tribunal. If you're 15, 14 and below, you don't have a review mechanism. So that's why it's important that people know where their entitlements are in terms of action, because the only other way to really enforce the rights of a child under 16 is to take some sort of human rights action, or take it to the court and say this child's being locked in a room 3 times a week. That's a deprivation of liberty, and there's no lawful process for anyone to review it outside the school. Well, that's wrong, and that's why we don't want schools being in a position of doing these things. We want to encourage them to go a different way.
Yeah. One last question. In terms of, you mentioned about children being placed appropriately, are you getting any particular concerns raised within the SPIM settings around restraint?
I'm getting concerns from everywhere. I'm getting concerns from mainstream schools, from specialist provisions, because obviously the school has no control over which children are placed. I'm also getting concerns from people that want to open specialist provisions and can't get them moving forward when we're going to be needing these. A lot of the issues are coming to me personally from special schools because they're such dire, urgent situations. And traditionally, school leaders would have gone to the Education Authority for help, but systems and relationships have been, as we know, fractured, and they're now coming to us and other organisations to say, can you help us? We don't know what to do. And I think for any teacher or classroom assistant or member of staff in a mainstream school or in a specialist provision, I mean, how specialist is it? And what level of behaviour the challenges is going to be there? What combination of children? So it's across the board, but I think there's a bit of a higher proportion coming from special schools to us at the minute.
Thank you, Michelle. Donna, you'd indicated next.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you. I'm just going to pick up Michelle left off there. It was just your experience. I suppose when we hear officials come in here, where it's the department or the EA, when we ask about collaborative work, they say it is ongoing. When we talk about early intervention, we talk about placements and policies. Genuinely, you would think everything is heading in the right direction. That's not what I feel on the ground. And I'm just wondering, like yourself, are you seeing any improvements even in the last 12 months? There has been wee tweaks here and there and policy changes. Are they making it worse in an operational sense?
There's two things there. They've hit the nail on the head with early intervention. If we could get early intervention right, we could teach children at a very young age how to use their behaviour as communication. And then when they're older teenagers, we may not have that distressed behaviour, and we may not have to require using a restrictive practice for behaviour that's out of control that we can't control. We've had a lot of children who are just left and haven't been served properly. I've just forgotten your question now, Danny.
It's just the on the ground stuff. It doesn't really matter.
Oh yes, the relationship between health and the relationship between health and education. It's not that there's no collaboration going. There's lots of pockets of good collaboration ongoing all the time, and that I think it has expanded some during this mandate because there's been an awful lot of talk about children's services cooperation. But relationships, when you try to get two different trusts to cooperate, or two different departments in a health trust, or two different bits of the education system to cooperate, you get friction and difficulty because you're asking people to change the way they do things. When you're asking health and education to integrate more what they do, that's going to be very difficult, and it hasn't gone smoothly. Certainly in this work, fractures have appeared, and relationships have not been as they should be. And I'm hoping, I always try to work on the point that you can find a solution and you can mend things and you can move on, you can get it done. And I don't know if we can do that here. It needs to happen. We need systematic cooperation, not just projects and piecemeal little bits of, goodwill. We actually need them to work really strongly together and to put systems in place to allow that. Now, there is a workshop planned between the Department of Health, the Department of Education. I know that we're going to be at it in relation to this work, and I'm really hopeful that we can use that as a way to try and drive this forward in a much more positive way, but it remains to be seen. At the end of the day, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, and I don't have an updated draft of the guidance. So I have words and conversations and understandings, but I don't have concrete proof that it's working yet. So that's as far as I can say.
As far as then, in a broader sense, when we talk about special educational needs and disabilities, on an operational sense, do you think the EA is on the right path?
That is as yet unknown. I think we're going through a very painful change process. There's quite a lot of good people in the right positions who have the skills, experience to bring forward. Operationally, I'm not seeing it yet. And I'm on different reference groups and I'm getting information and papers. I have concerns about how it's happening. Part of me thinks should we not just have expanded these services and then done the change? Whereas we're just, ripping up all the services, staff are going to leave, there's going to be changes in contracts, there's going to be pain before we get any gain. And I don't know where it's going. I feel a little bit in the dark, even though I've been provided with some information. There's a bit of a steamroller going forward here. Lots and lots of process. And maybe not enough focus on the person and on the people. But it's a huge operation, and we just have to wait and see. We've got the department's plan, it seems to be roughly going in, on the right direction ideologically anyway. But now we have to turn our attention and scrutiny to the Education Authority and how services are going to be provided early to children who need them.
Last point, and it would be around that where the Minister has laid out his action plan, delivery plan, but has hinted towards like a child not really needing a statement of education to get their education. And like I'm just dealing with a case that came by this week, and it's on placements where a child in that transition year of P7 to first year, and is now sitting with no placements. And the last update that only came through this afternoon was 2 schools that are nearly 10 miles away from where he lives, and this child would have left a school setting already in primary, and imagine
Really
just leaving a school.
frustrating.
It's really frustrating.
Really frustrating.
And that-
Every year. How many years now this has been going on for?
Yep.
The EA need to get a handle on this, and they need to be given enough resources to get a handle on it and get children into the right places and get them out of the wrong places and get them the proper support. But
Would you
if
be
you're
concerned,
sitting-
Rachel, sorry, that
Yeah.
if the Minister were to go down that route of removing statement process, like even a child with a statement, in my opinion, I'm using the word failed, but I look at it from rights-based. I actually think they're being treated like second-class citizens. I think it's just getting to the point of it's absolutely ridiculous and their excuses are just not good enough anymore.
If there's any move to reform the law on statementing, we will be very heavily involved in it and would vigorously oppose any move to dilute legal rights, because all we have at the minute are statements, because there is nothing else there. Now, if the other provision is all improved and put in place and schools can provide for children that need it, we will naturally find the number of statements will start to fall. That will be an indicator that the reform is working, because there'll be less children needing statements. But because of the neglect we've seen over the last 10 years, there's probably 10 years worth of trouble to come through the system yet before we'll start to see change. So I think now is not the time to remove people's legal rights, no.
And again, I say it's only been hinted at in that.
I have received hints of this and what they're doing in England and what they're doing. I've been looking at what's happening in England. I'm a great believer that we shouldn't always just do things because people are doing it somewhere else, unless it's working, of course, and then we should. But the one thing that's really good about our system is our legal provisions in relation to special educational needs and statementing. Now, you wouldn't think that when you look at the way some people are, talking about it and the treatment they've had. But actually, the one thing that's the jewel in the crown is our Education Northern Ireland Order 1996, because it's child-centred and it's full of really good rights. It just hasn't been properly operationalised. Thank you.
Just very briefly, Rachel, just on that, but on the terms of the legal framework, it's been hard sometimes to get a clear steer from officials on where this is at, but in terms of the revised code of practice, we're going back to 2016. Does the Law Centre have a view on whether it would even be appropriate to consider enacting that? Is it fit for purpose? Is it right for now? Do you have a view?
There's various conversations, is this too old now? And I'm like, well, the Offences Against the Persons Act 1861, that's old. So in legal terms, it's not old. We just haven't done it. Or have we? Because I can see a lot of it coming in through what I would call a back door in the form of the Graduated Response Framework, which the 5-year delivery plan says should be rigorously applied. And I worry that that's a lengthening of the early intervention pipeline. Should we enact it? It's coming in. If you look at the language, and the language...
Is there an issue with it coming in by way of practice rather than legislation?
Coming in by way of operational guidance as opposed to a new code of practice. But the good news is the original code of practice still stands. So my take on all of this is the 96 order and the 1998 code of practice are the law and the statutory code of practice. And all this other stuff and bureaucracy, frankly, is noise. And if I get a case coming to me, I'll be using the law and the operative code of practice. And I'll be looking very closely to see what this new system is bringing in terms of early intervention. And I would hope that it's not bringing a raft of bureaucracy. It needs to be early intervention. And if it doesn't provide early intervention, it hasn't worked.
I think that's the concern. As a committee, we hear regularly things that sound really good. This idea we're going to get support to children at the point of need when they need it. Who's going to argue with that? But operationally, when I speak to teachers, when I speak to parents, it's not always what I'm hearing. It's
the department has set the trajectory, and now we have to see. We have to allow the EA an opportunity, I suppose, to do it.
Absolutely.
But we have to also be mindful that something was consulted upon. We raised concerns about it. It's gone, disappeared, and now it's appearing. It's quietly in the background. and that's an issue.
Certainly something the committee will keep an eye on. Colin, you had indicated, just checking you still want to come in there. Yeah.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Rachel. Just two quick questions from me, if I can, Chair. Rachel, you note that not all schools recognise when a restrictive practice has taken place. Can I ask what minimum training or oversight mechanisms should be made mandatory, and what role should ETI or other bodies play to ensure compliance?
Thank you for your question. It was envisaged originally that ETI would have a role in inspecting schools. It was one of the recommendations that came out of the Department of Education's own strategic review, that the ETI would have a role in inspecting schools for these practices. In terms of, and I think that's right, that should occur. In terms of what training is needed, I think we need the department to tell us what its proposals are for training and what it intends to put into that training, and the department might need some support in identifying what should be in it. But it definitely needs to have human rights law, equality law at a reasonable good level, and then it needs to have some sort of practical element to it as well, because schools are crying out for practical guidance at the end of the day, and training is a great opportunity to, exactly like the question Peter asked me about what does this wording mean. Well, that's where you set out your higher level framework, and then you get into the nitty gritty of what do we do if, and I think that's where, and the training really needs to equip people that they feel confident that I actually know what I'm doing now. I know how to do it, I know what a restrictive practice is, and I know when I should or shouldn't use it. I know how to review it, I know how to document it, and I know who I should speak to. And they need to come away knowing those basic, tenets of human rights, really. But I think there's a bit more work to be done, and I suppose hearing from the department as in, well, what is your plan? Because that's a good question. I actually don't know what the exact plan is for that. Oh, your sound has just gone off there. Sorry.
Want to try again, Colin?
Can you hear me okay now?
That's you back. Yeah, you'd cut out for a bit there.
Alright, Rachel, just quickly then on the department's task and finish script, you described yourselves as a critical friend. So can I ask then, how would you assess the department's responsiveness to that critical feedback during the guidance development process? And has there been any genuine openness to change?
I would have to say there has been, and they have accepted, on the face of it, that criticism. I mean, we're going to be critical when we have to be. That's what we're there for. We're there to call out public authorities when we think they're not going down the right route. So we had written correspondence to the Department of Education, but I think the committee may have been shared by the department with the committee. And we laid out all of our concerns. The department then responded to us, and they dealt with each and every concern that we'd raised. And I thought there was quite a positive tone. Obviously, it creates difficulty when you're trying to work together and you fundamentally disagree about something. But I think that we have tried very hard to work together. We have written now further correspondence to seek further information, and we just have to see how that goes. I think that everybody wants to get this over the line, frankly, and they don't want to see it fallen by the wayside, because everyone's worked too hard for too long, and it's too important for that. So I think there have been difficulties, but ultimately it's a good working relationship is how I would assess it.
No, that's great. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Colin. I don't have any other indications at this stage, so I think that brings that session to an end. So thank you, Rachel, for your time today. It's been a really, really helpful overview of all of the history and where we're at now of this issue. So the committee will continue to keep in contact with you on this and the other areas of your work. But thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So while Rachel is just making her way out, I want to just make a suggestion that given that the next briefing that we've got coming in from NIPSO is going to cover some of the same issues, there may be other issues in there as well, but certainly the restrictive practice issues will be in there, that we maybe agree on, and if there's any follow-up actions after item 7, if that's okay. So can I just check, are we okay to move on to item 7, or are members looking to get a quick comfort break? I'm happy to take a break or move on, whichever works for everybody. Happy to continue. Item 7 then, members, I'll just refer you to the briefing note from the committee clerk at page 61. Sorry, I should give you an introduction to the briefing. It is going to be a briefing from the Northern Ireland Public Services Ombudsman, NIPSO, in relation to the issue of restraint and seclusion or restrictive practice, as we were directed to, perhaps in terms of terminology in the last session. There will be reference to NIPSO's report into the complaint made against the Western Trust on this issue, but also some wider reflections on the educational landscape in terms of complaints that are coming through NIPSO, and that's something that we can broaden out in our evidence session as well. So I'll just refer members to the relevant papers, and then we'll do welcomes and introductions. So there's a briefing note from the committee clerk at page 61. There is a briefing paper provided by NIPSO at page 63. There is the NIPSO report, which was the complaint against the Western Health and Social Care Trust at page 66. We have the NIPSO overview report on the restrictive practices in schools at page 121. And then we have the NIPSO sectoral insights report on education, page 145, and the school case digest from NIPSO at page 150. Again, apologies members for the long list of papers, but it's all really helpful material. So just want to first of all welcome Margaret Kelly, the Northern Ireland Public Services Ombudsman, and Sean Martin, the Deputy Northern Ireland Public Services Ombudsman, to committee today. You're both very welcome, and we do really appreciate you giving up your time, both to look at this issue around restraint and seclusion, restrictive practice, and that wider educational landscape in terms of NIPSO's work. So it's been a briefing session we've been keen to get for a while, so we really are very, very glad to have you here and appreciate the time that you're giving committee. So I think that the issues that are going to be considered have been set out, so really it would be handing over to yourselves for any initial opening remarks or presentation you want to make. If I could ask for that to be up to 10 minutes, and then we'll move into question and answer from members. And if we can try and keep each inquiry to 5 minutes per member, just to give us a sense of the sort of timelines we're working on. But over to yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you to committee for asking us to come. So I will try to keep my opening remarks brief, because I imagine committee want to focus on some questions. So schools came into our jurisdiction in 2017-18, and since that time they really account for about 12 to 13% of the total complaints that comes to us each year. In the last 3 years, the complaints from schools have gone up by 51%. So there were 92 complaints from schools in 22-23 and 139 in 24-25. But I would say to you that is in a context of increasing complaints to my office. So most other sectors were also increasing, and the overall number increased. On average, half of school complaints that come to us get to stage 2, which is our investigation complaint, our stage. So they often will come prematurely, so people won't have finished the school complaints process, or it might be that we direct them back for some reason. So about half go to investigation stage, and at that stage we will try to resolve the complaint to the satisfaction of the complainant as well as the public body. And in the very vast majority of school complaints, we do manage to get a resolution and an outcome for the complainant, and that is particularly important because of the close relationship that parents will have with a child's school, because the importance of that being an effective relationship for a child who are going to spend quite a lot of time there. And a breakdown in a relationship with the school has really implications for children, often meaning that they move school because a complaint can't be resolved, or where a relationship really breaks down. So it is important that we try to resolve where possible. About 5 to 8% of the complaints that come from school then go to further investigation, and I describe that as our big 52-week investigation. And you have a copy of a report that was about the Western Trust but involved issues around restrictive practices, and that tends to be more serious complaints that go through that, or it can indicate a unwillingness on the part of a public body to really engage in the complaints process and to get resolution. In terms of the main issues that come through schools, staff attitudes and behaviours, special educational needs, that includes restrictive practices, and you will see from the overview paper, restrictive practices do come up on a regular basis through our complaints, and I describe NIPSO as the tip of the iceberg. So by the time you're bringing a complaint to my office, you've often been through a 1 or 2 year journey, and you need real determination and perseverance to do that, but you also need to have a real concern, so people don't bring those complaints lightly. Complaints about bullying, complaints about access to transport, and complaints about complaint handling. We set out in our Schools Digest the best practice for schools to really encourage them to use complaints to both address parents' and children's issues, but also to learn and improve practice. And the themes from those were a real lack of communication with parents and children, a failure to follow school policies, very poor record keeping, a failure to follow school complaints handling policies, and when it came to the Board of Governors, what we saw was a lack of understanding about the independence of their role, and in particular the independence of their role when it came to handling a complaint or complaint process. You will know, I think, committee, that my office is engaged in introducing a statutory complaint standards approach across the public sector in Northern Ireland, which is a really significant piece of work for a relatively small office. So we've completed local government. On the 1st of July, we will be launching the complaint standards for all of the health and social care. And we have a timetable that says complaint standards in schools will be in effect in 2026-27, but just to say that that is on board. Just in broad terms, and I imagine you're going to ask me about the report, so I am going to refer to Mrs Shakespeare and to Harry. So my investigations are done in private under the legislation, but in fact Mrs Shakespeare has been public about her complaint, and I did ask her permission to allow me to refer to her and to Harry. And as you will know, the complaint was not about the school, but it was about the Western Health and Social Care Trust and the Paediatric Occupational Therapy Service. We did not investigate the school because a school complaint was not brought to us, and we understand that that is still a matter of ongoing legal challenge. And as committee will know, you kind of have one of two routes. You go the legal route, or you can choose to come a route to my office. But if you choose to go a legal route, then my office cannot investigate that. So that's why we didn't investigate the school in this. So, and you will also know that Harry was a 6-year-old child with really significant additional needs. He was a child that was fully mobile and did walk, and he didn't have verbal communication, so he could not explain to his parents what was happening. And we did find in our report that Harry was subject to unnecessary restraint, which led to distress for him and his family. And I'm not going to do the details. I imagine you might ask me the details about the report, but you will know that Harry wasn't subject to that restraint on just 1 or 2 occasions. And in fact, it is the case that Harry was subject to that restraint by the use of 2 very different chairs. And when Mrs Shakespeare raised the issue about the first chair, actually the second chair that was used was even more restrictive. And that was a real concern. We also find that really there was a failure to consider Harry's human rights, so there was a failure to consider his fairness, respect, equality or dignity, and that the actions of the Western Trust did not meet the guidance that was in existence at the time around restrictive practices, and that is that they should be used as a last resort. They should be the least restrictive possible and used for the shortest time possible. So we're happy to consider the detail, but suffice to say that Harry was subject to a level of restraint that did not meet the guidance and that caused real distress and ongoing distress. We also made a number of findings in relation to complaints handling, and I think, again, we're happy to to talk about that, but the case is one of a number that really illustrates the importance of appropriate guidance on restrictive practices for both healthcare staff and for school staff. And there was significant failings in the complaint handling by the Western Trust in this report. And I'm sure members might ask me in the report about some of the discussions at Board of Governor level and some of the issues around culture. So just to finish by saying, I know we're discussing this particular report, but overall restrictive practice does come up in our complaints. It's usually linked to a lack of appropriate records, a lack of consultation or consent with parents, and in the majority of complaints that I've seen, parents have inadvertently found out that there have been restrictive practices used with their child, a lack of up-to-date policies and procedures, and a lack of a failure to follow those, and a lack of appropriate complaint investigations, which is why they then come to my office. So that's me broadly setting out, but both Sean and I are happy to answer particular questions.
And that's great, and thank you for those opening remarks. I just want to maybe to ask a slightly broader question, but still on the issue of restrictive practice at this stage. If I'm right in saying that your report into restrictive practice in education was 2021, is that right?
That's correct.
So given that we're 4 years on from that, and I think the concluding remarks in that report were that you were not going to undertake an own initiative investigation at that time because actually it looked like there was really positive work going on in the space and the department was taking forward a lot of the necessary actions around producing fit-for-purpose statutory guidance. Based on our last evidence session, it's not clear that the progress has been made, and 4 years is probably longer than any of us hoped we would have to wait. Has NIPSO had cause to reconsider that position in terms of the need to become involved with an own initiative investigation at this stage, given the lack of progress?
So when we issued that report in 2021, we were concerned around restrictive practice, and indeed the former Ombudsman was concerned around it too, and we did see real movement and we saw that draft guidance from the Department of Education, and we did hope there would be real movement. You will understand I have a small own initiative team and many demands upon it, but given where we now find ourselves, I am not ruling out that we may need to go back now and reconsider if there is not, if we don't see movement on this and there isn't appropriate guidance. It may be that we do now need to go back and say, well, actually, is that time to look at an own initiative on that? I've just recently announced a proposal around an own initiative in relation to housing, so there are many demands on my own initiative team and my own initiative powers, but I know in this report we did say we'd keep it under review, and it may be that now is the appropriate time. So I'm not saying, I'm not making a commitment to do an own initiative, but I'm certainly making a commitment to go back on the light of what is currently happening.
It's not closed in terms of the possibility of looking at it. And look, as someone who sits in the audit committee, I know that your budget has to stretch quite a long way in terms of the breadth and range of issues that you cover. So I am mindful of that. But it does strike me, you mentioned 19 complaints on restrictive practice. That's proportionally quite high in terms of the number. Would I be accurate in saying that is proportionally quite high?
It certainly is an issue of complaint that comes up regularly, and when it comes up it tends to be more serious. So it is obviously an issue of concern to me that we deal with that right. And I think what's of real concern to me is that there is clear guidance for parents and children, but also for schools, and that guidance is consistent across schools and healthcare settings. So actually there needs to be less confusion around this, greater clarity, and people actually understand, and staff and schools understand, that the decision to have a restrictive practice with a child is a significant decision to make, one that requires consideration, assessment, proper documentation and consultation with parents. And it's not something to be made because it is convenient or easier at that particular time, while taking account of the fact that schools can often be under pressure.
And I suppose just to add to that, the issue around training and that approach, which is about
That's helpful. Just to the Western Trust report, probably just a brief question. What were the recommendations in that report around the learnings in terms of how education and health should be working together in these contexts? Were there recommendations in relation to that, and do you feel they've been taken forward?
You want me to take that? And you can add. So in terms of, obviously it was a report to the Western Trust, therefore the recommendations related solely to health, but it was in a school setting in terms of the delivery of that paediatric occupational therapy service. So throughout the report you see mention of a photographic seating plan. So that photographic seating plan and the issues that have arisen from it would have enabled the school to understand what was acceptable practice for the use of that particular chair and for that particular child, with a proper assessment having been done. So we found that that wasn't done. So one of the recommendations related to that being used and accepted by the Western Trust, that the use of photographic seating plan, the sharing of that plan with the school staff, and written briefing about how that then would be implemented for a particular child. So we have received evidence from the Trust that that is now part of their practice. There was also a recommendation around training for the Trust staff. So while we didn't make a recommendation directly about education, the effect of the recommendation to the Western Trust will have approved that cooperation between education and health to make sure that there's an understanding, particularly with those specialist seating, as to how those chairs should be used. Without getting into too much of the detail, the first chair, as Margaret has alluded to, was a very basic chair for a child that didn't have huge postural needs. And the second chair was a very specialist chair for a child who had real particular needs for postural support, and yet Harry did not actually need that level of support, and actually that could be extremely detrimental. So it was really important. There was no assessment before that second chair was used, and that was again really something as specialist that there should have been a clinical need, and there was no clinical need established.
So, and in terms of, so we investigated the Trust, and in terms of my legislation, and so we are really clear that obviously we investigated the Trust staff in a school setting, but we were not investigating the school. Because that is a matter of legal. So I did actually have to be careful about where those particular lines were. Now, we did say that there had to be regular multidisciplinary meetings to discuss issues with restrictive practice or seating use, and the development of a specialist handover form and restrictive practice approval form. Now that would have been the responsibility of the OT in the school setting to do that and hand it over. The Trust assures us that they have put those in place for their OTs, but I would not be able to check that with the school because I did not investigate the school.
I just have one sort of further broader question, and look, I know that you've mentioned that sort of statutory complaint standard for education is a 2026 task, so don't expect you to have a document in front of you of what that's going to look like. But just in terms of sort of your regular engagement with complaints coming through the education space, and I appreciate the guidance you've produced for schools and boards of governors. We saw recently the Audit Office appeared in a committee pack with their good governance guidance. Very conscious that what we're looking at here on both those, and those two things are clearly connected, is guidance. Do you think that across the board, school boards of governors are properly equipped and supported to manage complaints effectively, both at the lowest level when an issue first emerges and as it escalates?
So I would have to go on the basis of what I see in my office, and obviously what I see in my office are those complaints that do not get resolved and where people have remained very unhappy. So on the basis of what I see in my office, do I think that those school governors have been equipped to handle those complaints? I don't. I think they are often unclear about their independent role from the principal and the staff, and that in terms of investigating a complaint, it is actually very important that they understand the independence of that role. I think they probably need, and I understand school governors are all volunteers and they're all giving up their time, but they need more support and training to enable them to do that. And I think that is difficult. We have, as part of the general complaint standards approach, we have put out, we've recently put out 10 videos about how to investigate a complaint and the different stages of that, and that's available for all public bodies. We will, when we launch the health complaint standards, be launching a set of good practice guides, and that can go. And finally, later on in the year, we will actually have 8 30-minute training videos, which again will be for all public bodies, so they won't be particular to a setting that public bodies can host on their learning management. So I think it would be very helpful for schools to be using that with their Board of Governors. But what I see is the Board of Governors aren't given the skills and the training and the support that would enable them to do that. It may be that I don't see the ones that are very good.
They may never cross your path and understand that. And I suppose just to close that off, do you think that in terms of the legislative picture that we have, that the department and the EA have sufficient powers when something's going wrong in the Board of Governors to intervene? Or you must see cases where you would have perhaps felt that there needed to be an oversight from maybe some other body?
I suppose in relation to complaints, that is obviously us, and we will report on that. And through our previous publication in relation to restrictive practice, you will see that those complaints have clearly been to the Board of Governors before they've come to us, and they have not identified what was a really serious issue. So that does point to a Board of Governors at times not effectively operating. Now, I think those matters are matters of training and not one where you would expect another body to step in to take the responsibility of the Board of Governors. I don't think I've seen anything through our complaints that would suggest that the Board of Governors isn't trying its best. That there is a training need and a development need. I think probably in my time I have seen one issue where it looked like the Board of Governors were not acting in the best interests of the school, and I think at that point then there needs to be a discussion as to whether someone else needs to fulfil that role. Obviously a school will still function, there is a principal, there are staff who will be focused on meeting the needs of the children in it, but governance is really important. So I think if there is evidence, just like any other publicly funded service, where it isn't meeting its statutory objectives and not meeting the best interests of the children in the school, then I think somebody should. As to whether there are sufficient statutory powers, I think that's really probably a matter for the department and the EA rather than the Ombudsman.
That's helpful. Deputy Chair.
Thanks, Margaret. Your maladministration, or your office's maladministration investigations have identified a number of recurrent themes in regard to restrictive practices, and these include lack of appropriate records, lack of consultation with parents, lack of appropriate up-to-date policies and procedures, lack of appropriate complaint investigations by Board of Governors. And given that complaints to your office have risen by 51%, are lessons not being learnt at all?
So we have lots of individual schools in Northern Ireland, and do I think that across those the lessons around restrictive practice have been learned? In truth, I think we probably have a long way to go on this. I think that if we get a complaint and we investigate, we obviously go back and check compliance. So we say you need to do this and this and this, and we'll go back and check, have you done? But that can be one individual school, and obviously we hope that means that individual school then changes how that is going forward. I think there is a real lack of clarity around restrictive practices in schools, and I think that extends to learning when things go wrong. I think there's a lack of clarity on the guidance. We know that. I think there's a lack of clarity on the practice and how the guidance is put into practice. I think there's a lack of clarity about when people complain and the kind of response they get. And then I think there probably is a lack of clarity about learning the lesson and changing it. So in that sense, no, we haven't learned the lessons, and I think we have more to go on that.
So one of the best practice guides that Margaret has alluded to that it's well developed, and actually it's based on our look at international research around learning from complaints, is to publish a best practice guide on how do we learn from the mistakes we've made. And I think probably this assembly and lots of committees, there is a focus around the amount of time on scrutiny and how do we then embed the learning from the various investigations, whether it be an audit office investigation, an NIPSO investigation. I think we see improvement, as Margaret has said, in individual cases. I'm not sure that is as widely shared as we would hope. We do our best, but actually I think those in governance roles have a responsibility to know what's happening in their sector and then put that on the agenda so that they each individually embed the learning within their organisation. And say we have a best practice guide that is focused on how do you learn from complaints. So say rather than it getting to the ombudsman, you look at it, if you're in a governance role, you identify the issues and you embed the changes. And hopefully collectively, when we publish something or another scrutiny organisation publishes something, those messages get shared across the education sector, and then those in governance accept those check. Is this happening in our school? Can I be satisfied in my governance role? And you ask those questions of the principal and you say, what are our policies like? Do we record instances of restrictive practice? When is it being used? So those people with a governance responsibility have a real responsibility to ask those questions and receive the assurances around are things being learned. Yeah, and I understand that, and I accept the whole thing about the lack of clarity, poor training, and so on and so forth. But does that account for 51% is a hell of an increase? Has any analysis been done as to why there has been such a big increase?
So the 51% is across school complaints, yeah. And there could be lots of reasons for that. So one is we have, as a Public Services Ombudsman Office, gone and done lots of engagement, because actually if you don't know we exist, then you won't know if you need to come to us if you have a significant complaint. So we think some of the increase is about that, some of the increase is about the pressure that public bodies are under, and some of those issues around the quality of public services and how that gets affected. So they're not all about restrictive practice, they're about broad school complaints. But I think there is a real issue about if we don't have clear guidance from Department of Education and Department of Health, because you have healthcare people working in school settings. So if you don't have clear guidance about restrictive practices that cover both of those, and schools are putting restrictive practices in place and parents are not aware, then how do we actually expect that to get better? To get better, you need to have clarity. You need to have clarity for teachers and healthcare professionals. You need to know what are we saying about restrictive practices in school. Really, it should be the absolute minimum. And the healthcare guidance says what they would like is the eradication of restrictive practices, but certainly its reduction to the absolute minimum. Are we saying the same thing to schools? And are we really clear with schools about what restrictive practices are and when and how they should use them? And if we're not, then how do we expect them to get better? People need that, and they need that understanding to be able to get better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, given what you have said, that there are people from health working within school settings, does it concern you at all that the RCN have withdrawn from the department's task and finish group?
And obviously that's an issue for the RCN. What does concern me is that we seem to have stalled in getting that guidance and clarity for people. And I think we do. I think parents and children need it, but I also think staff need it. So it concerns me that we've really stalled on it. So it does. And I think we are clear that we would expect that to be child rights based and child right focused, because we do take account of the upholding of human rights when we undertake our investigations, so we would expect all of that to be compliant. So it does really concern me that we somehow seem to have got to a place where the work on that has really got stalled and seems to have got into difficulty.
Yeah. I mean, there needs to be a clear focus on the goal here.
Just to finish briefly, Sean.
Yeah, just that there's a clear goal that I think many people who are involved in discussions share. And that needs to take precedence in terms of, I mean, the consultation, we issued our report in 21, the consultation was 2023, we're now heading towards halfway through 2025. There really is a need for that guidance to be issued and for it to be, as Margaret has said, rights focused, and no contradiction between health guidance and Department of Education guidance, because that would not be helpful at all. As Margaret has alluded to, health staff are working in education settings, and we know the PHA are doing some review around that, but they are working. Are you optimistic, Sean, that that's going to happen anytime soon? I think, you know, there comes a point in time where the department, if they can't get the task and finish group to come to a common view, they have the responsibility to issue the guidance to enable progress to be made. And I suppose our experience around some of these issues is that then people start to work together to achieve the objective, and while they're debating what should be in guidance and what it should include and not include, once you actually take that step, then you resolve the practical issues around implementation. But the first step in this is issuing the guidance. Thanks, Chair.
Just to pick up on that, and do you have a view and understand, you know, if you feel I'm drawing you into territory that's not your remit, completely understand, but do you have a view if the guidance can be delivered effectively, if there is a decision taken not to repeal Article 4.1c of the 88 order?
I think the issue around legislation and whether it be amended or changed is one of policy and not one for the Ombudsman. So I think we probably wouldn't want to be drawn into whether the Minister should remove that or not, and we're very clear, you know, that's an issue that others have raised and are probably better placed than us around whether that is a piece of legislation that fits within a modern rights-based framework.
No, look, I thought that might be your response, and I didn't want to draw you into a policy space. I suppose it was more if, from your handling of complaints, you've identified a conflict that might exist there that you could share. But again, if it's drawing you into territory that is outside of your remit, it's totally appropriate, so that's fine. Okay. Just looking for other indications. Are there members, Danny?
Yeah, it's more of a, thank you. It's more of a broad look at the complaints. Are you seeing an increase in complaints in regards to children with disabilities and additional needs? And what, if so, then what are the recurring, if there is recurring themes within them?
So that is always there in our complaints. Like that is that theme of children with special educational needs is always there in our complaints. And so when you come to the Ombudsman, so you might come to me about one thing, but you might go to the SEN tribunal about another, which would be appropriate. So it's always there. And the things that we see most often is we do see restrictive practice. We do. And when that happens, that becomes a real concern for parents, and can be such a conflict in school. We see issues around the level of support that children with special educational needs get, their educational plan and how that gets put in place. We've seen things around their reduction in school hours and their removal from schools. We see some issues around bullying. I think we've had some very early things around access to transport and getting children who have special educational needs to school on time when transport is provided, and they're probably no different from lots of the issues that you've already heard. Those are the ones that tend to work their way through to the office. I don't know if I missed anything about that.
So I think that issue around restriction on the school day is an interesting one, because I mean we would look at that from this perspective of, if you've restricted the school day, what steps are you taking to build the child up to then full attendance and their full entitlement? And quite often we don't see a plan. The plan is restricting the school day, and we would look at that from, okay, you've come up with a rationale of why at that point in time there's a need to restrict. So what's your plan then to get the child? And that has recurred, I think, over a number of complaints that we've seen over the years. I think part of or issuing really drawn firm conclusions from the complaints we get is the relatively small numbers that eventually make our way. But that goes to one of the complaint standards pieces of work that we'll be looking at, because we will be looking at those issues that go to schools to be recorded and then reported, and then that allows us to analyse what parents are bringing to the schools. And it goes back to one of the points you made, Pat, around learning. Good complaints handling at stage 1 by a school should be able to resolve 75 to 80% of complaints. So that's what we would expect through our complaint standards approach, that you get the record of it, of the issues that's been raised, you record it, you report it. That allows broader analysis of the concerns that are being raised. You can then look at what those resolution rates are. At the minute, we really don't have all that data, and nobody can look at it and say, what are the recurring themes in complaints that are happening across our education sector?
What you see is the complaints that come to me, but I am the absolute end of the process. And to be honest, it does take real determination and perseverance to come to the office, because you'll already have been through the school complaints process, and you might have ended up going to the EA, and you might have decided you'll go to DE before actually working out that where you needed to come in the end was us. But so we will require under complaint standards that schools record every single complaint, and that schools publish every year the number of complaints that they have got, at what stage they were resolved, and a broad overview of the issues. So they will be required to do that, and that will give you a different level of information.
If I look at it, at what comes my way, and that increase and reduced timetables and stuff, and I would raise a lot. And I feel sometimes that it falls under the schools a wee bit, when really the responsibility and the failures is lying with the EA. And I had a particular case, but the parents didn't actually want to come forward, because I use it as an example here when the EA were in, and it was about a child who was offered a place in a spin, but it wasn't ready yet. So these months went on. In effect, the child had 30 minutes of education between September and then, I think it was just after December, and around December, that they get into the module, and the parents just didn't feel like they wanted to put the blame on the school, and it didn't really go anywhere. But I'm just saying, I use picking up that type of thing on the failures of the EA in this.
It's funny, because certainly I have picked up the media around issues like that, but we haven't really seen those complaints. That delay in provision. Every year we know schools start in around the 1st of September, give or take. And yet a recurring issue every time we get there is the lack of ability to make sure that every child has a place that's appropriate for them. We don't really get those complaints. They're not coming through. And
we have seen, you'll see from what I give you, we have seen a real increase in complaints about EA, but we've just finished our year. So if you look at what I gave you, in 22-23 we had 20 complaints about EA, 23-24 we 26, and in 24-25 we went to 35 on those. So we will do an analysis looking at what were they. But even at that, I mean, we know that people that will be underreported. That will be by the time people get to me. So there is a real role for EA. But people are reluctant. People always think people complain all the time. They're actually quite reluctant to complain.
Yeah. Well, they do. They come to you when they're in desperation.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. You'd mentioned about your standards are going to bring in requirements around reporting of complaints. Will there be anything, do you anticipate, around time frames? I mean, one of we hear feedback that sometimes people feel like things are so protracted that the child can have left the school before it's resolved.
So absolutely. So there are set time scales of it's a 2-stage process. First stage, the idea is speak to the people and try and resolve it. So 5 days. That should enable you to understand the complaint and have a conversation. If you can build a relationship of trust, listen to the person, understand their issues, then try and resolve it at that first stage. And as I say, some of the data we've looked at, if you do that well and you empower the people who engage, you can resolve 3/4 of those and even more if you're really good at it. Then the second stage is a 20 working day stage. And what we find is that is exceeded in many cases, and sometimes it does take longer, and we make allowance for that, but there needs to be communication and there needs to be a reason to extend beyond that. So part of the data that hopefully will become available when we take this approach is to be much more open about how long is it taking to deal with these complaints. it is not unusual for people, particularly in the health and social care setting, for complaints to go on for years. They've already been through a traumatic situation that has led to the complaint, and then the complaints process itself adds further trauma to that, traumatises people. We have seen, and in one of the examples that was in our overview report in restrictive practices, the person had gone to 50 other organisations before they came to us. They were going around the houses being passed from pillar to post. So I think there are big improvements that need to be made around the public sector more generally, around handling complaints and the data that we publish, and that can then be scrutinised. And I say hopefully our complaint standards approach will improve that so that we have much greater visibility of what is actually going on.
That's very helpful. I mean, we're looking at the school uniforms bill at the moment, and obviously there is an enforcement aspect to that, and I think there's a concern around the department are looking to legislate in the space of they won't get involved until the school complaints process is resolved. That makes sense. But if the school process takes an incredibly long period of time, that's where the concern would sit. So.
We could step, and we have a discretion. So while our Act says that ordinarily you would expect the organisation to complete that process, but we retain a discretion. So one of the discretionary grounds would be that it's taken too long and there's no evidence that it's going to come to a conclusion. So I think, that again, that's something we could explore, what people's experiences are. I mean, it is not helpful, and we have seen those complaints where a child has left a school before certainly we finished the investigation because the complaints process is going on for too long, and the child hasn't then benefited.
But I think, Nick, there's something about people knowing what it is they're complaining about and therefore who they're complaining to. Yeah. So if you're complaining to the school about something that's happened in school and the school has done, then you do the school's complaint process, and if you're unhappy, you come to my office. You don't actually go to DE or EA. If you have a complaint that's about EA, you go to them. If you have a complaint that's about DE, you go to them. So there is something about just real clarity for people that they don't need to go to school and then go to EA and then go to DE, that they can actually, the school is a public body in its own right.
Yeah. It may be, and there's certainly time if as an organisation you wanted to respond on our call for evidence on the school uniforms bill because your name is absent from that bill, and it is very much a complaint to school DE intervene process. So it may be something you want to. Yeah, sure. Yeah, Peter, do you want to just comment?
Oh, that's very kind. I wasn't expecting to get straight in there, Chair.
If it's just on that point,
it's on. Yeah. Well, look, I'm sort of happy to wait. I don't want to, but it is on that point. It was just.
If it's a point or a question, is it a quick intervention? Because I'll bring David in if it is if you're wanting to come.
Well, we all know I can't do quick intervention, so let's not pretend and just hand over to David.
Bring David in.
I'll
just wait.
I think my question's been half answered, so I'll let him go. I'll come after. It's all right.
Everyone's being very considerate. Peter, over to you.
Great, my back again. That was very good. It was just, Margaret, I think that was incredibly useful in terms of how you explained the complaints process, especially in educational terms here, because I think that's really useful, because that is something that I think people, especially parents, need to know, that actually the school is that unitary unit in itself, but you have to go through that process, and then you go straight to NIPSO. So I think that in itself has been really, really valuable, just clarifying that. I wanted to ask a question around how long is too long, and certainly I'm aware of some cases that have taken quite a long time for it to make its way through the normal school processes and the Board of Governors in particular. So I suppose my question is, how long is too long? How do you determine that, and then what powers do you have?
Okay, so how long is too long? Well, our complaint standards are saying stage 1, 5 days. Stage 2, investigation, 20 days. Working days.
Yep.
So our expectation is when a public body gets a complaint, they should be able to deal with it in those timescales. And once complaint standards gets to all of them, they will be required to do that unless there's a clear explanation as to why they haven't. So if you have a school complaint, I would say, Sean, we said don't put a figure on that, but it's running for months. So if you're
well done, you didn't put a figure on it.
Or 5 months down the line, and you're still,
Yeah.
I think that is, you're getting to a long time. So we don't have if you come to the office and you say to my frontline staff, I haven't had a final report from my school complaint yet, but actually I've now been complaining to them for 6 months, then what the staff are likely to do is say, look, go back, tell them you've talked to us. We might even write to them and
we
say...
would probably ring the school
and
say, where is this?
Where is this? What's happening with this?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll give you 4 more weeks, or we'll give you that. But then we would say, but if you haven't issued your final report by that, we've told the complainant come back to us, and if you come back to us, we'll make an exception. So we do. It is better if public bodies can resolve their complaints.
Of course.
It is better for all concerned if public bodies can resolve their complaint, but we would make exceptions. So it's hard, sometimes complaints are complex, so it's hard to say to someone, but in terms of complaint standards, we're saying 5 days and 20 days, and if you need more than either of that, then you need to be talking to the complainant, you need to have laid out clearly to them why it's taking you longer than that. I don't know if that's...
No, that's brilliant. I mean, I scribbled down there, I added together 5 and 20 and came up with 25, which is 5 weeks, essentially. Yeah. So in theory, if a parent was unhappy, and it had taken 7 weeks, I mean, legitimately, they could come to you at that point and say, you know what, this is meant to have been done in 5 weeks. It's been 7 weeks. Can you do anything? And you might go, well, look, just tell them you've been to us and write them one more letter and say if you don't reply within a week or whatever, you're going to go to the ombudsman. Yeah, okay.
We would usually speak to them and say, look, what is the hold up here? And they might say,
Yeah.
look, we have a Board of Governors meeting in 1 week's time where the final response to
raised.
that will be signed off.
Yeah.
That's not helpful for us to intervene in those circumstances.
Of course.
If there's no sign of any progress at all, then you'd be saying to the school, unless you can show us a sign that you're actively investigating and going to respond to this complaint, then that's when we would kind of go, right, it's time for us to take this on and look at it. And I say we are really keen that bodies deal with their own complaints. They're their complaints, they're about their service. There should be that focus on learning and resolution, and the Board of Governors are key to, the first, usually in the school's complaints process, it will be the school staff who will have dealt with it. And the second stage in the guidance will issued by EA. Not all schools have adopted the EA guidance on complaints. I'm aware of a school that had a 5-stage process. Now, I mean, you'll not get through that in 25 days. So while we're saying in complaint standards 5 and 20 days, and when we were starting to look at this, the EA engaged with us, so the guidance they issued was kind of modelled around where we were likely to get to, but not all schools have adopted that.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. David, I'll bring you in now.
Yeah, some of it's probably been covered, but so apologies if it does seem like duplication, but it's just to hone it. You've laid out again there in the last couple of answers there almost your role in the process, the preference we just heard in terms of the bodies dealing with their own complaints if and where that's possible. Could I just ask generally then, from your own analysis, and if it's not something you want to comment on, that's fine, but in that sort of process chain, you think that works okay, that is satisfactory, and both in terms of the chain to get to yourselves and in terms of your overarching role?
I'm not sure I fully understand. So
I guess, do you think that process looks like how it should look like from your probably experiences working in other fields as well? Is that a fairly standard, and do you think it's a satisfactory process to get to yourselves?
I think the complaints I see, schools struggle with complaints, and I think they sometimes struggle with the concept of a complaint, with the concept of parents coming to them saying, I am not happy about this, and I think that's about culture. So I think our public bodies need to shift their culture as well as their process.
Is that about just a blanket sort of, what do parents know? You're a parent, we're teachers. What is it you're saying here in terms of the culture? Like, what is the we're professionals? And
yeah, I think there's a and that's not just about.
I'm not saying
school.
that's right or wrong.
Yeah, and that's not just about school complaints.
There'll be instances where it is right.
I see that where public bodies say, we're the professionals, we know what should happen here. Why are you complaining about this? Actually, it's fine. Yes, of course, we see that frequently. And that is about culture, and that is about openness. It is about transparency. It is about willingness to learn. And those are things that I think across our public bodies, and maybe it's part of why the Assembly decided to give my office the complaint standards powers, because complaint standards isn't just about shifting the process. In some respects, shifting the process is the easy part. It's about shifting the culture. So would I say to you that I think complaining to a public body now, including schools, is always, or perhaps even often, a satisfactory experience for a member of the public? I suppose I would probably say no. I think we have much to do in terms of a culture of openness, transparency, a willingness to learn from complaints. Do I think the process where you come at the end to the Ombudsman's office is right? I do. We quite simply, we had 1,333 complaints to the office last year. We're an office of just over 60 people, and there's lots of those people who are not doing the frontline complaints part. And if you think of the size of the Northern Ireland public sector, the number of complaints that you would have, it would be impossible for any office, I would say. But also there's a bit that's about how do public bodies learn if their complaints always come away from them? You need to shift the culture so they encourage complaints, so they don't just allow them, they actively encourage them, and then they actually listen and learn. And that is, as you will know better than me, not something you do overnight, but it is part of that complaint standards process. I am finishing my post in August 27, and for myself, I want to ensure that all public bodies in Northern Ireland have the complaint standards process in place, so everybody is signed up, everybody has that requirement, everybody will be starting that process where they're publishing their complaints, and we have more complaint data and analysis. But the one around culture will take much longer and much more work, but we have built it into how we're doing it, which is why we're doing it sector by sector and taking a while to really try to engage people.
Of one more question after this, but do you see that on both sides? I imagine we all in our offices see this. You can have an unreasonable complainant as well as the body itself being a complainant. So I think that's probably trust to both sides that actually they're going to be fairly dealt with in that respect too.
So we do see unreasonable complainants. Yeah. I would say that it is a small number. Yeah.
Especially by the time it gets to yourselves in that regard.
And by the time it gets to ourselves, if people have lost trust in a public body, that's really difficult to put back in place. But it is a small number of complainants who are really unreasonable, and part of what we are providing for the public bodies is resources and support around what to do if somebody's really unreasonable. Although I would also say sometimes people start out reasonable and the process can be so frustrating that they can end up in
Can I just ask one more final question? Yes, thanks very much. Yeah. I think what you said there is actually a relevant point worth raising around the rising complaints. Part of that will be actually your own awareness training, because I think actually out there isn't necessarily an awareness of NIPSO and what it does and where it is in these processes. Do you think more could be done, and what more do you think to be done to map out these processes for parents or whoever may be relevant stakeholders?
Part of the work we're doing in complaint standards as we move from sector to sector. The actual document we produce for each sector contains 3 sections. So one sets out the broad process, the 5 and the 20 days. The second is a guide for organisations in terms of how to move towards this new approach. The third part is a guide for individuals who want to complain. So it will look at each sector and the things that are unique to it. So if you got to education, you would acknowledge the role of the SEND tribunal. So if this is what you're looking for, you need to go to the SEND tribunal. If it's a complaint about the school, well, you would come to the school, you go to the school and then you come to NIPSO. So part of what we're trying to do is remove the confusion around the various processes that exist. If it's a child protection concern, you go this route. You might want to speak to the AA about that and raise it, or you might want to go somewhere else in terms of a different issue. So we will map those various processes and overlapping things that exist and try to remove some of the confusion, as I've alluded to previously. In the issue of seclusion, the complainant had gone to 50 organisations, including the AA, CCMS and a whole range of other bodies before they actually got to us. Now, their complaint was about the school and it should have come onto us, And those bodies should have known that and have directed it to us. So I think there is an absolute confusion.
I think there's been issues here where actually, as elected representatives, sometimes we haven't been entirely sure of what the direct line was. So I think that it's not just parents struggle with it as well. Absolutely.
And we have a small engagement team, like 3 or 4 people, and they've done, like over the last 2 years, they've done something like 220 different organisations, and we try to focus that around organisations that maybe have people who are more vulnerable. But the thing about that engagement and that understanding, that's not a one-off. So that's like, you need to keep doing that. That's a real. So we do have like quite a focused programme of engagement, but that is something that you need to continue to do. But without doubt, it is one of our strategic aims. Without doubt, there is still more work for us to do on that, and that's.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Close that one there. So I have an indication from Michelle. Nobody else, if anyone online does want to indicate, just let us know. But I think final indication, I think, from Michelle.
We thank you both for the evidence. We've covered a lot, so I've just got a couple of smaller questions at the end, I guess, to wrap things up. Just to be clear on consequences around some of this. So we've talked about per complaint handling. Obviously that creates work for yourselves. And we've talked about the report in terms of Harry's Law and recommendations. So if there's per complaints handling within public bodies, are there any consequences for that for them? And if they don't take on your recommendations as well, equally, are there any consequences that they face?
In terms of recommendations, an ombudsman's recommendations are non-binding, so we are not a regulator. However, the very vast majority of public bodies accept our recommendations, and there are a number of routes open to me, including laying a special report before the Assembly, which I'm thankful to say I haven't had to do if they don't implement those recommendations. But we also always have a conversation with the public body too, so the complainant will see our draft report, the public body will see our draft report, and we will have recommendations in that. And because sometimes we recommend something that a public body says to us, like, that just won't work or doesn't make sense. So in the main, they will put those recommendations in place. I think in terms of complaints handling, while at this point, so for something like schools, we will say you need to rewrite your complaints policy, we want to see it, you need to train your staff in complaints handling, we want to see that you've done that. Those are the kind of consequences for them. I think under complaint standards, slightly different.
Yeah, and I think the key role here is our role as public bodies. You would expect a public body to comply with the recommendations of the Ombudsman, and they do. I mean, we report in our annual report and accounts if that doesn't happen. But the ultimate recourse is the Assembly, and then it would be for probably this committee, if we laid a special report about education, to decide if you wanted to take evidence from that public body. And when I say public body, I mean a school. So if the Ombudsman had made recommendations and the school had decided not to implement them, and we believed the injustice remained on remedy, it would be open to the committee then to ask that public body to come to account for itself and the reasons why it felt that it couldn't implement the Ombudsman's recommendations. I mean, there's a debate that goes on around Ombudsman, and regulatory powers, and actually we don't have an issue with getting compliance with our recommendations, and actually we would spend a huge amount more resource if you shifted it to that model of powers and enforcement and notices, and I don't think that is the way to go.
No, and the other thing, of course, is that under the new NIPSO legislation, I have the power to publish my reports, which actually wasn't as widely available, and so we do publish the very vast majority. So I think maybe about 80% of my reports last year got published, and they're all on the website. And public bodies don't like to have very critical reports about them published, and that is another mechanism by which to encourage them to improve, because that's not something that you would want to repeat. And I do think that's important, that there is a range of mechanisms there for them.
The last bit was just around, I guess, your own resources. So, I mean, we're talking about, you would expect in the public sector that they do have, as you said, good complaints procedures. And within schools, we've talked about some of the complaint handling, and it ends up on your desk, basically. We've also then discussed perhaps an own initiative investigation around restrictive practices, and that being something that might be constrained by your resources. So talk to me about just the impact of what would be quick fixes for public bodies if they were perhaps there's more guidance provided to school governors around this to help them tighten up their practice that would free you up to do some of this more substantial work, and other investigations that you're holding for individuals. I'm managing a case with a constituent at the minute who are waiting a long time in their report. You guys are very stretched, so what could we do to help, I suppose, in that sense?
I think there's a number of issues, and I think we have to acknowledge the role of the Assembly Audit Committee, who have been very supportive throughout your term, Margaret, in terms of providing the resources we have asked for. But I think as a public body operating in a constrained financial climate, we are also very mindful of the resources that we ask for. But I think you've kind of some way answered your own question. If public bodies themselves improved how they handle complaints, that would allow us to reallocate resources to those bigger, more systemic issues. So our own initiative team and its ability to progress a number of issues at the same time is limited. So really, when we announce something like, say, housing, which Margaret has alluded to, we'll put a lot of resource into that for a period of time, and that then prevents us doing something else. Whereas we saw improvement in how public bodies handled complaints. So in 2016, when NIPSO was created, we had 575 complaints. We're now at 1,333. So we need to see that stabilise, and then internally we'd be able to refocus the resource towards bigger, more systemic issues. Now, I have to say, while we do individual complaint investigation, that takes up most of our resource on the Public Service Ombudsman side, we do get systemic improvement from those individual reports. So I can think of a couple of examples, not necessarily in the education sector, where we have seen, and they didn't even get to further investigation. They got to that second stage where we went, there's a systemic issue here. What are you going to do to address it? And the department have given us a commitment to fix it for the individual, but to make the change across the system. So while I think systemic change is what you really want, whether that's through an own initiative investigation or through where it's not just about things have gone wrong for the individual, but actually trying to put it right for more people. So I think if complaints handling was better and that rise that we're seeing year on year levelled off, then we could look at how we better use resource towards more systemic investigation.
Yeah. And if the chair just indulge me 1 second, because I don't think I could leave this session without just acknowledging the work that you did on Harry's case and supporting Deirdre. That was so vindicating for them. It meant an awful lot, and I guess it represents the kind of work that you do and how impactful that it is. So thank you for the work you're doing on that, and I think you've demonstrated, I think twice that you've been here this session, just the value of what you do. Maybe it's some of those work is maybe quietly behind the scenes, like you say, but it's having an impact. So I'm glad you had the opportunity there to speak to your resources, because I think it's important work that you do.
And I'm really glad you brought it back to Harry, because actually, this issue around restraint and seclusion, it's easy to see it at that big level, but actually that's about a 6-year-old boy who couldn't speak and who had a really distressing experience that he shouldn't have had. And when I do my health work, which is a huge chunk of what we do, we talk about avoidable harm. And I suppose one of the things that I wanted to say to committee around restraint and seclusion is there is an issue of avoidable harm. So actually Harry suffered a harm from that could have been avoided. And as committee deliberates on restraint and seclusion and what you're going to say on it, there is something about putting that lens on it as well, that actually getting those right is actually about ensuring other children and young people don't experience that harm. So it is really important that we do that. And I think that we don't often put the lens of avoidable harm on education. We put it on healthcare and patient safety all the time. But I think it is there, and I think it's an important one for the department as well to look at as they look at how they go forward.
No, absolutely. I think that work has been really impactful. You're right to bring it back to the child at the end of the day. And I think I push back a lot on the hysterical mum stereotype, this trope that you get all the time, and mothers in particular raise their voice to defend their kids. And you've added, like I say, a level of credibility and vindication to what was absolutely a very legitimate problem, and has opened this conversation here today as well how much of a problem that was. So if Deirdre hadn't come forward, we may not be doing this today, and it's really important that we did. But again, you provided a credibility to her complaint that perhaps wouldn't otherwise have been dealt with in that way. So thanks very much for it.
No, thank you.
Thank you, and I think very appropriate note to finish on. As with other than just to emphasise, if there is interest in responding on the school uniforms bill, just as it does have a quite a significant complaints management dimension at the end, would be very good to hear from you.
Okay.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, committee.
Yeah.
Okay, so just while the witnesses make their way out, we'll just finish with any other any actions arising from that. Just really from the two evidence sessions. I want to note really at this stage. I mean, I think it is it's clear that this is a very, very long running issue. There is a very, very long history to this, and it's been really right and appropriate that we have focused on Harry's Law and the campaign around that, because of it perhaps helps us focus on an individual case that brings it to life. But there are many, many other parents, quite clear from the NIPSO evidence, that are complaining on this issue, and there was concern raised by both witnesses at just that we seem to have reached a bit of an impasse where this has stalled. I would like to suggest that the committee give consideration to bringing a motion to the Assembly on this, to see if we can have any role and any part to play in kick-starting action on this, because I'm really concerned that we're looking at drift, and perhaps as Sean highlighted, that the task and finish group is that there needs to be some sort of injection into that process to get things moving again. So I'll put that out to members. I think there are issues around getting the statutory guidance brought forward, and I think potentially around really establishing what are the departmental intentions around Article 4.1c that came through very clearly from the Law Centre evidence. So I would like to suggest the committee give consideration to that, and would be content for the clerk to bring forward a draft of a motion covering those issues, but would open up to the floor for members' views at this stage if there are any. Michelle?
I would be absolutely supportive of that. I think the session today has demonstrated that we're waiting long enough for this to actually be progressed and get over the line, and anything we can do as a committee to push that along, I think we should use the mechanisms that we have available to us, and a motion would be a really good way to do that.
Members agreed for the clerk to bring a draft to next week's sitting? No objections? No. I mean, I would probably want to just also put in the record, I think the committee does have options available to it around bringing committee legislation, and in terms of that, repeal could be something that committee could be thinking about, and we can see how this matter progresses. But it does seem to be a substantial sticking point that is holding the process up, and it is regrettable to my mind that we had the previous education minister accepted some of those recommendations wholesale, including the Article 4.1c repeal, and we seem to have had a shift and with the current minister in post, and I'm not really clear as to why that is being delayed. But we will see where we go with the discussion on that next week, so we'll take that forward as an agenda item. Okay, so that brings us to item 8 on the agenda, which is correspondence. And sorry, my computer has just locked itself. I need to get back into the papers. As usual, there is a summary note which is provided at page 166 of the correspondence, and then the correspondence itself is found at pages 166 to 209, and it is really just to go through any items that would require a committee decision or discussion. Otherwise it will be as per the summary note. So I'd refer members first to item 8.5 on page 183, and that's a response from the Department of Education on actions being progressed to address workload issues, including timelines for delivery and the scope and timeline for the work of the independent review of workload. Happy to open that up to members. I would be content to note at this stage it does seem that work is commencing, but it does seem at a very early stage. And I did just note we are fast approaching summer when some of that engagement with schools in particular and school leaders may well not be able to be facilitated. So I think I just would want to put in record it's absolutely vital this doesn't drag out beyond November, so I would be suggesting we may want to seek an update as soon as we are back from summer recess to really ensure we are assured that the process is on track. And there are a lot of issues in the mix in the industrial relations space of education at the minute, and I think any sense of delay on this would not be helpful. other than that, are there any other points to note or content to note that item? Content to note. Item 8.6, page 185, is a response from the Department of Education on special educational needs funding for capital, and also capital funding for integrated projects that were previously under the Fresh Start umbrella, or and some are complete, some are progressing. So really just open up for members' views. I would be content to note at this stage, unless there's anything anyone wants to add. Danny?
Yeah, I suppose I would like to know what were they're planning for special educational needs schools, part of the capital. We know what we need.
Yeah.
It's just what work's being done.
Yeah.
Where have they identified and what stage they're at.
So we know the capital money set aside. What are they going to do with it, and what's the plan? Yeah, no, I think that's a perfectly reasonable request. I'd be certainly happy to endorse that. Are there any other, if we're agreed, or any other suggestions? No. Item 8.11, page 209, it's correspondence from the Department of Education, and it's a written update on their 24-25 provisional outrun capital budget and 25-26 initial approved budget breakdown. I would be suggesting that we note, but probably just to add a caveat, I'm not sure if it was formally communicated to the department, and I do take their point. They did brief us in March on capital issues, so perhaps we were a little hard on them for not attending at the previous budget briefing. But I would like to propose, if members are agreed, that future budget briefings have resource and capital input, because it really it did make conducting the evidence session difficult, that there were lots of lines of inquiry just couldn't progress. So unless anyone has any other views, we happen to...
No, I'm totally in agreement with you, Chair.
Yeah. Okay, agreed.
Messaging has happened.
Okay, that's great. So that's been communicated, and then just to check on table paper. So nothing tabled there in correspondence. Keep me right, Clerk, if there's anything I've missed. No. So other than that, are members content to dispose of the correspondence as per the summary note at page 166 with those exceptions? Agreed. Okay. Item 9 is forward work programme. So there's a draft forward work programme at page 214. Actually, I think tabled is an updated one again, which members may want to refer to. So I'm going to make two suggestions. First of all, ask the clerk to speak to the forward work programme, and then we'll hopefully be able to move to endorsing that. But if members are agreed to, then after that, just to move into, as it does flow as we're considering the school uniform bill, just to move into a very short closed session, and really just to do a check-in with members on where thinking is at on the bill, and if there is anything in relation to specific amendments or issues for raising with the department that we would like to take up at this stage. I don't think we should be constrained by the fact we don't have a school uniform briefing on here today. Time is short on it, so if members have issues they're wanting to take forward, best to do that at this stage rather than waiting indefinitely. So if we're agreed on those two suggestions, I'll hand over to the clerk.
Okay, so members, you'll just see the next few weeks begin to be populated by school uniform stakeholder meetings, and the Chair and I have discussed the order in which we try to populate. So we're trying to put people in on the Wednesday main meeting first of all, and then if it is convenient, the hour-long one on a Tuesday morning, and then kind of third, the option of 4 to 7 on a Tuesday. So next Tuesday morning we will have the Human Rights Commission between 9 and 10. You can join that remotely or in the Senate chamber. Then in the main meeting on Wednesday we have NIPSO and NAHT, so views from the unions on school uniform. NIPSO are also going to give an update about some of their work on racial incidents in schools. And menstruation matters are to be confirmed for next week, but they'll be next week or the following week. Then on the 3rd of June in the Tuesday afternoon slot, we have Nikki, the Children's Commissioner, and then also the Nikki Youth Panel, and the Youth Assembly, I think, communicated with me during this meeting actually, so they are to be confirmed. They're confirming.
Could I just come in there just on a really practical point I noted today on the order paper for the 3rd of June that we have the spring supplementary estimates, which is obviously potentially a long debate, so I think it's really important we have quorum for that youth session on the school uniform bill. So if there's any scope for any members who would be planning to speak to that debate to try and get in early on the speaking list, so as we do have quorum, and certainly from my perspective as chair, I'll do my very best to do that. So just to note that, and for members to be checking well in advance. Sorry to have interrupted.
No, that's grand, Chair, certainly. And I mean, were there to be a vote, we would automatically suspend the committee meeting anyway, so that you could participate in plenary. Beg your pardon. So the 4th of June, then the main meeting, Competitions and Markets Authority will speak to the committee, and obviously there's a parallel consultation going on with them on the matter of the cap clause 4 of the bill, how that might develop and eventually be commenced. So that will be an interesting one. Also parenting focus and potentially the Women's Support Network as well coming in there, both of whom are groups that have done work on this already. And the 11th of June, we're still scheduling some of those stakeholders that were flagged by Raise last week, and also some diversity stakeholders, just because the committee has raised the issue of inclusivity in uniform a couple of times. Correspondence just on uniform has gone to the bill team for lots of clarifications, to the Bill Clerk in the Assembly Bill Office for some amendment text, to Legal Services for just their broad view and their advice on convention rights in the bill. And just in terms of timing and getting the process, getting to grips with it early on, the Chair and I discussed earlier that on the 11th of June, we will try to have the first informal clause by clause run through of the bill, so that members can start to think about what each provision entails and whether they need more information about any one of those clauses, or any other like amendment text or background to help them think about the decision they will make in due course. So we would do that in closed session. So eventually at the end of the process, the final part of the committee's report will be a decision on each provision. The decisions open to the committee will be that, I guess, a clause stand part of a bill or does not stand part of a bill. So you could remove a clause. You could amend to introduce a new clause of your own making, or that you could amend the existing clauses and agree those clauses as amended. So those are the range of decisions that you can make. So yeah, we'll do that a couple of times informally in closed session, and then eventually at the end of the process do it in public, and that will be the report to the rest of the Assembly then, so that it can move on to amending stages in plenary in September. I think that's all I had, Chair. The bill team from the department actually have I kind of asked them to make themselves available flexibly, just given the tight time frames that we have. So obviously if there's something very high level where the committee needs a ministerial assurance or some other judgment by the minister, that might take a bit longer with the clearance process, but as this is the team that has worked up the policy area and instructed the drafters on the detail of the bill, the two officials who've appeared before the committee already twice will be available to come in after we've had a bunch of evidence sessions, just so that they can do any clarification that might be required on just as to understanding, or how did the bill end up going down this particular route, like can you tell us what happened, or what does this particular phraseology mean, for instance. So they'll be readily available. They'll join us by Teams or Zoom to take your questions.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Just from my perspective, on a practical note, if I would just add, and I think we've got the calendar invites through for Tuesday's session, but just for anything else that is locked in, just to get those calendar invites out, just to help members keep track of those things in their diaries would be really helpful. And I certainly think the approach of trying to populate the sessions in our Wednesday sessions is the best approach, and those other sessions are as a bit of a safety net if they're required. But do members have anything that they want to add or comment at this stage in terms of that forward work plan? The only thing I would add is just it may be the case that we don't need all of our Wednesday sessions for school uniform evidence. So I just want to get a steer from members if there is opportunity to fill an evidence session with another stakeholder on another issue. If members have a view on who that might be, my instinct would be that probably issues around the SEND space are most relevant, and if we do need to fill a session, really it's to get the committee's agreement at this stage that the clerk and our team can go ahead and do that. There's a range of issues around SEND people have expressed an interest in. Are we agreed, or is there anything else that feels pressing? Should time allow it? No, agreed. Okay.
The other thing is that our service standard requires us to have your papers with you for a main committee meeting 3 days in advance. So if we don't have, a bulletproof Tuesday school uniforms meeting, we'll try to put in like an informal meeting where we can, just give you papers a wee bit later. But you should know on a Thursday if there's something happening on a Tuesday.
Okay. That's great. Thank you. Okay, so just with members' agreement, just in case there are any specific amendments or particular thoughts on the bill, if we were agreed just to move into closed session, I would imagine for a brief session, just if there's anything proactively we can be doing at this stage, so if we could just move into closed session if we're agreed.
Committee Room 29, Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, Sound.
That's us back in open session, and just for the record, and for anyone engaging from the public, there was a brief discussion around there were any amendments to be taken forward at this stage on the bill, but it was agreed we would pause that until our next evidence session on school uniforms. Okay, so that takes us to item 10, and that's any other business. Do members have any? Cara, looking to come in.
If I can come in, hopefully you can hear me okay. Just a note, I had a really interesting meeting with the National Association of Children of Alcoholics, and some of the work that they're doing across these islands to support children who are facing what is a form of educational disadvantage. They've just put on record that they can offer us a briefing should we need it, and perhaps even one of their ambassadors like Callum Best could come and speak with us as MLAs about lived experience of being a child of a parent who struggled with addiction, and how that interacts, I suppose, with academia and a child's educational outcomes. So just to put that on record and something for us to consider.
Thank you, Cara. And I know you'd mentioned briefly to me that you'd wanted to highlight this after your meeting. I think obviously we are all aware there's a wee bit of pressure probably in the next number of weeks, but I would certainly be very happy to reach out if you're happy to share contact details through the clerk to sort of welcome that opportunity. And if they want to provide any written material in the first instance to committee to help us understand the nature of their work and the issues they cover, then we can potentially look at a face-to-face or informal engagement down the line. So certainly very happy to make that contact if members are agreed. Agreed. Okay, that takes us to item 11, which is date, time and place of next meeting. That's scheduled for the 27th of May at 9 a.m. Well, actually no, we have an earlier meeting, which is actually, that is correct, Tuesday the 27th. It is, I've got that right, at 9 a.m. room Senate chamber, not room 29, and also online. So again, if members could make the clerk aware of their attendance for that. Other than that, just to put the question that the committee meeting does now adjourn. We agreed?
Agreed.
Committee Room 29, sound.